There is a particular kind of commander that wars produce only rarely. Not the careful strategist who wins by patience, not the diplomat who holds alliances together through compromise, but the man who moves toward fire when every reasonable instinct says to pull back. The man whose value to his country is inseparable from the danger he poses to it. The man whose greatest victories and most catastrophic failures are cut from exactly the same cloth. William Frederick Halsey Jr. was that man. He was not the most brilliant naval mind America produced in the Second World War. He was not the most technically precise, not the most analytically gifted, and not the most cautious. By any measure, not the most cautious. What he was, in the winter of 1941, when the Pacific Fleet lay broken and burning at Pearl Harbor, was exactly what a devastated nation needed. Someone who was already furious, already pointed at the enemy, and completely unwilling to wait. That fury carried him to the cover of magazines. It carried him to command of the largest naval force in history. It carried him into decisions that saved campaigns and decisions that nearly destroyed them, sometimes in the same week. This is his story. It begins not in the smoke of battle, but in the quieter world of a 19th century naval family, in the port towns and drawing rooms where boys grew up, understanding that the sea was not a romantic backdrop, but a profession, a discipline, a calling that asked everything of the men who answered it. Halsey grew up inside that world, shaped by a father who wore the uniform and a home where the Navy was not simply a career choice, but a kind of inheritance. The values planted in those early years, loyalty to the men beside you, contempt for hesitation, the conviction that the right response to an obstacle is forward pressure, never left him. They hardened with age rather than softening. By the time the world caught fire in 1941, they were not just personal traits, they were tactical doctrine. But the story of William Halsey is not a simple hero's journey. It does not travel in a clean line from young midshipman to fleet admiral, from obscurity to glory, from trial to triumph. It doubles back. It stumbles. It contains a commander who reinvented himself in middle age by earning his aviator wings at an age when most men would have considered the physical demands insulting, and then contains that same commander, years later, driving his fleet into the teeth of a typhoon and losing nearly 800 men to a storm he should have avoided. It contains the admiral who transformed a collapsing campaign at Guadalcanal through sheer force of will, and the admiral who left an entire strait unguarded at Leyte Gulf and came within a handful of decisions, none of them his own, of turning the largest naval battle in history into an American catastrophe. To understand Halsey is to sit with that contradiction and resist the temptation to resolve it too quickly in either direction. His admirers want to weigh the early victories so heavily that the later failures become footnotes. His critics want to weigh Leyte Gulf so heavily that everything before it becomes prologue to a single catastrophic error. Both instincts miss the truth, which is harder and more interesting than either, that Halsey's virtues and his flaws were not separate things living uneasily side by side. They were the same thing, expressed at different moments. The aggression that electrified a broken fleet in December of 1941 is the same impulse that emptied a critical strait in October of 1944. You cannot surgically remove one and leave the other intact. He was a whole man, and the whole man is what history received. What makes his life extraordinary, viewing for anyone who wants to understand how the Second World War was actually fought, not in the clean diagrams of after-action reports, but in the fog of real-time decision-making under impossible pressure, is precisely this wholeness. The great turning points of the Pacific War passed through Halsey's career like a thread through a needle. He was at sea when Pearl Harbor burned, and he stood on deck in Tokyo Bay when Japan surrendered. Between those two moments, he touched almost every major phase of the American naval war. The early carrier raids, when the outcome of the conflict was genuinely uncertain, the Doolittle mission that reached into the heart of Japan itself, the grinding attrition battles around Guadalcanal that determined whether the Pacific would remain a Japanese lake or become an American highway, the island-hopping campaigns that severed Japan's empire from its resources, and finally, the relentless carrier strikes against the home islands that preceded the end. To follow his career is to follow the war. To understand his decisions is to understand how American sea power grew from a fleet in shock into the most dominant maritime force in the history of armed conflict. Over the next several hours, that is exactly what we are going to do. We will move through his life in full, from the naval household in New Jersey that formed his earliest sense of purpose, through the convoy duty of the First World War that sharpened his contempt for passive defense, through the extraordinary mid-career decision to become an aviator that placed him at the cutting edge of naval technology, and into the fire of the Second World War, where his name became, for a time, the most recognized in the Pacific. We will follow him through his finest hours and sit with him through his worst ones. We will not look away from either. Along the way, we will meet the men who fought alongside him, the commanders who argued with him, the sailors who worshipped him, and the historians who have spent decades trying to render a final verdict on a career that refuses to submit to simple judgment. We will ask the questions that his story demands. How much aggression is a virtue, and at what point does it become negligence? How does a commander balance the moral obligation to protect the men under his command against the strategic necessity of accepting risk? And what does it mean that the same qualities that made Halsey irreplaceable in the darkest days of 1942 were the qualities that placed his fleet in the worst positions of the war's later years? There are no easy answers, but there are honest ones, and we are going to find them. If you are new to this channel, this is the kind of history we make here. Long form, deeply researched, built for the hours when the world is quiet and your mind is ready to travel somewhere it has never been. Hit the subscribe button now so you don't miss what comes next. Because after Halsey, there are more stories waiting. Commanders, campaigns, decisions that change the world made in seconds by men operating on fractured intelligence and pure instinct. For now, settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the weight of the day fall away. The Pacific is enormous and cold, and it holds more history than any ocean on Earth. Somewhere out on that water, in the first grey hours of December of 1941, a carrier task force was turning for home, its admiral standing on a bridge, listening to a radio transmission that told him the world he had known that morning no longer existed. He did not grieve. He did not hesitate. He reached for the enemy. That is where we begin. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a harbour town at night, when the water lies still and dark beyond the docks, and the only sound is the slow creak of rope against wood. It is the kind of quiet that shapes children who grow up near the sea, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something enormous, waiting just beyond the visible edge of the world. William Frederick Halsey Jr. was born into that world on the 30th of October, 1882, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, a city whose waterfront had looked out across the Atlantic for generations. His father, William Frederick Halsey Sr., was a naval officer who carried the profession's rhythms and disciplines into the family home, as naturally as the tide carries salt. The boy grew up understanding, without needing to be told, that the sea was not a backdrop to life, but the central fact of it. Uniforms were not exotic objects in that household. They were simply what men in the family wore. His father's career took the elder Halsey away from home for long stretches, and in his absence, the family's maritime identity deepened rather than faded. Young William absorbed stories of distant stations and foreign ports with the intensity of a child who instinctively understands that those stories are not entertainment but instruction. He was not a delicate boy, nor a bookish one. He gravitated toward physical contests, toward the company of other boys who settled arguments with their hands before they settled them with words, toward any activity that involved speed, contact, and the honest verdict of who was still standing at the end. There was something in his temperament that chafed against patience, that found waiting harder than any physical effort, and that quality would prove both the engine of his ambitions and the source of his greatest difficulties. It is tempting to see the mature commander fully formed in the child, and of course, it is never quite that simple. But the outlines were there, pressed into him by blood and circumstance, before he ever set foot on a ship of his own. The path to Annapolis was not straightforward. Halsey's academic record in his early schooling was not the record of a scholar. He was capable enough when a subject held his interest, but his restless intelligence moved quickly from one thing to the next, and struggled to settle into the methodical accumulation that formal education demands. He needed an appointment to the Naval Academy, and appointments were political gifts, not automatically given to naval families regardless of tradition. His father's connections within the service community helped, as did the family's evident seriousness about the profession. This was not a household pursuing a naval career as a social ornament. When the appointment came through, and Halsey arrived at Annapolis in the late 1890s, he entered an institution that had been producing American naval officers for decades, a place of rigid hierarchy, exhausting physical routine, and an academic curriculum designed to test whether young men could endure sustained pressure across multiple disciplines simultaneously. It was, in short, a place designed to break the merely enthusiastic and keep only those with genuine reserves of determination. His performance at the academy reflects the man he was becoming with almost uncomfortable clarity. In the academic rankings that the Naval Academy published and that followed officers throughout their careers, Halsey sat in the middle of his class, not at the bottom, which might have endangered his commission, and nowhere near the top, which might have opened different doors. He was not the student who mastered navigation theory by the elegance of his analysis. He was the student who learned navigation by doing it, by being on the water, by trusting instinct where others relied on calculation. What the classroom grades could not capture, and what Annapolis's official records therefore understated, was the force of his personality among the men who lived and trained alongside him. Leadership is not a grade that institutions can reliably assign. It is a quality that emerges in the spaces between formal assessment, in who the other men follow when the rules are temporarily suspended and something real needs to be done. Football was where that quality became visible. The Naval Academy's football program was a serious enterprise, not a casual extracurricular activity, and the culture it created was one of organized violence, channeled through teamwork and endurance. Halsey threw himself into it with the kind of commitment that his academic subjects rarely extracted from him. On the field, he was aggressive in the way that good football players must be aggressive, not recklessly, but with a calculated willingness to absorb punishment in order to inflict it. His teammates recognized something in him that coaches and professors were also beginning to notice. He was at his best when the situation was worst, when the controlled chaos of a close contest forced everyone to reach beyond preparation into whatever reserves of competitive fury they had privately stored. That capacity under pressure would define his command style in ways that even he may not have fully understood when he was simply chasing a ball across a grass field in Maryland. He was commissioned as an ensign upon graduation in 1904, stepping into a navy that was itself in the middle of a transformation. The era of steam power and steel hulls had replaced the age of sail, but the doctrine and culture of the service were still working out what that replacement actually meant for how battles should be fought. President Theodore Roosevelt had rebuilt the American fleet with an urgency and national pride that made naval service feel consequential in a way it had not for a generation, and the young officers entering the fleet at that moment found themselves in a force that was powerful but not yet sure of its own identity. Halsey reported aboard his first ship with the particular combination of confidence and ignorance that belongs exclusively to junior officers in their first weeks at sea, convinced of their own readiness, entirely unaware of how much they do not know, saved from catastrophe only by the patient expertise of the petty officers and chiefs who have seen young ensigns come and go for 20 years and know how to manage them. Those early years at sea were his real education, and he pursued them with a thoroughness that his academy grades had not predicted. He moved through a series of assignments aboard destroyers and smaller vessels, the workhorses of the fleet, the ships that demanded hands-on commanders rather than distant administrators. Destroyers at the turn of the century were not comfortable ships. They were fast, cramped, prone to violent motion in heavy seas, and crewed by men who needed their commanding officer to be present and visible, rather than sequestered in his cabin. Halsey was constitutionally unsuited to sequestration. He wanted to know his men by name, to understand their particular skills and weaknesses, to be seen alongside them in the worst conditions, rather than insulated from those conditions by rank. This was not purely calculated leadership. It was temperament, the outward expression of a man who genuinely preferred action to administration and human contact to solitary authority. The aggressive instincts were developing alongside the loyalty, and the two were not separate qualities, but aspects of a single disposition. Halsey believed that the purpose of a military force was to fight, and that commanders who forgot this purpose in favor of institutional self-preservation or bureaucratic caution were betraying both their men and their mission. He had watched, in his reading of naval history and in the living examples around him, what happened to commanders who waited too long, who weighed risk until the moment for action had passed, and their caution had become its own kind of catastrophe. He preferred the era of attacking when he should have waited to the era of waiting when he should have attacked. This preference would, over the course of a long career, prove correct, often enough to make him a legend, and mistaken, often enough to cost him dearly. But in those early years at sea, before the weight of command and consequence had fully descended on him, it was simply the natural expression of who he was. The Navy he served was an institution of intense social hierarchy, where a man's class standing at the academy could follow him for decades, and where promotion moved slowly along grooves cut by seniority and connection as much as by demonstrated ability. For a middle-of-the-class graduate without political allies in Washington, the path upward required patience of a kind that Halsey found genuinely painful. He was not humble about his own abilities. Humility was never the dominant note in his personality. But he was disciplined enough to understand that the system rewarded perseverance, and he was determined enough to persevere even when the pace infuriated him. He was building a reputation in the fleet, the kind of informal reputation that moves through a service by word of mouth, that tells officers at every level which names to remember and which to discount. His name was one that people were beginning to remember, and not always for reasons that would have satisfied the Naval Academy's academic instructors. There were moments in those early deployments that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Not dramatic moments, not battles or crises, but the quieter accumulation of nights at sea, watching a horizon that could conceal anything, of engineering challenges resolved through improvisation when proper repair was unavailable, of men who performed beyond expectation when a commander trusted them enough to demand it. These experiences were writing something into Halsey's character at a level below conscious awareness, below strategy or doctrine or deliberate self-improvement. They were teaching him the particular truth that the sea teaches to everyone it keeps, that the distance between control and chaos is always smaller than it appears from the shore, and that the only response to that knowledge, which is not eventually fatal, is to close with the uncertainty rather than retreat from it. By the time the world began moving toward the catastrophe of the First World War, William Halsey was no longer a young ensign feeling his way across the deck of his first ship. He was a seasoned officer with years of sea time behind him, a body of experience that had shaped his instincts and confirmed his biases in roughly equal measure, and a gathering sense that the professional proving ground he had been preparing for his entire life was approaching. He did not know its precise shape or location. No officer of his generation could have predicted the specific form that the coming upheaval would take, but he felt it coming with the particular clarity of a man whose entire nature is oriented toward conflict rather than away from it, who reads the weather of his era the way an experienced sailor reads the actual sky, not with certainty, but with an intuition built from long practice and deep attention. The boy who had grown up listening to sea stories in a naval household, who had discovered on a football field that he was most fully himself under pressure, was ready, or at least as ready as any man can be, for something he has never yet faced. The Atlantic Ocean in the years of the First World War was not a place that forgave hesitation. It was cold beyond the tolerance of comfort, grey beyond the reach of imagination, and beneath its surface moved an enemy that could not be seen, could not be reliably tracked, and struck without warning, from depths that the technology of the age was only beginning to learn how to probe. For a young naval officer shaped by a childhood of maritime tradition, and already carrying within him the instincts of a man who needed to be moving forward at all times, this was both the ideal proving ground and a source of profound, grinding frustration. William Halsey arrived at Destroyer Command, not as a man seeking safety in a posting far from the front, but as one who understood, almost instinctively, that the small, fast ships of the escort fleet were where the war at sea was actually being decided. The great battleships sat in harbor, their enormous guns pointed at a threat that never materialized in the form their designers had imagined. The war belonged to the destroyers, and Halsey knew it. Convoy escort work was unglamorous in the extreme. There were no thundering broadside exchanges, no great formations of capital ships maneuvering against each other under signal flags and the eyes of an admiring command. Instead, there were weeks at sea, in waters that heaved and pitched without relent, men clinging to cold steel railings as spray came over the bow in sheets, the constant mechanical labor of keeping aging destroyers running in conditions that punished every weakness in their hulls and engines. Halsey threw himself into this work with the full force of his personality, learning the rhythms of his ships and his men simultaneously, building the kind of practical seagoing knowledge that no classroom or shore posting could ever manufacture. He was not a theoretical officer. He was a man who understood machinery through his hands, tactics through repetition, and leadership through proximity to those he led. The crews of the destroyers under his command were working men from ordinary American backgrounds, and Halsey spoke their language without effort or pretension. The German U-boat campaign of the First World War was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most dangerous military developments of the early 20th century. At the height of its effectiveness, the submarine offensive was sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced, threatening to starve Britain into a negotiated settlement before American industrial strength could be brought fully to bear. The statistics told a story of creeping catastrophe, tonnage lost month by month, the slow arithmetic of attrition working against the Allied cause with a quiet efficiency that was in some ways more frightening than any single dramatic defeat. For the officers charged with responding to this threat, the early years of the campaign were an exercise in institutional impotence, as naval doctrine struggled to catch up with a form of warfare its architects had not fully anticipated. And at the center of that institutional struggle was the question that Halsey would spend the rest of his career answering, in his own particular way. Do you wait for the enemy to reveal himself, or do you go looking for him? The American Navy's initial posture when it entered the war was one of considerable caution, shaped in part by the unfamiliarity of the submarine threat, and in part by the habits of an institution that had not fought a major naval war in 2 decades. Senior commanders debated strategy in terms that seemed, to the officers actually at sea, disconnected from the reality of what was happening beneath the waves. There was institutional resistance to the convoy system itself. The idea that the correct response to enemy submarines was to concentrate merchantmen rather than disperse them ran against certain deeply held assumptions about how protection worked and how naval forces should be deployed. Halsey watched these debates from the deck of a rolling destroyer with a combination of impatience and incredulity that he made little effort to conceal from his peers. He was not a man built for waiting, and he was not a man built for the kind of cautious, defensively minded thinking that struck him as tantamount to accepting the enemy's terms. What the convoy experience gave him, beyond frustration, was a laboratory for his emerging tactical philosophy. He watched what happened when escort commanders responded passively to the submarine threat, when they maintained formation, held their course, and prioritized the safe delivery of the ships in their care over any aggressive response to a contact. The results, in his reading of them, were not encouraging. The U-boats were patient, methodical, and utterly unintimidated by a posture of restraint. They would probe, withdraw, reposition, and strike at the moment of their choosing, treating cautious escort commanders as tactical obstacles to be circumvented rather than threats to be feared. Halsey drew from this a conclusion that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The most effective form of defense was an attack that kept the enemy too busy surviving to think about anything else. It was not a subtle philosophy. It would not always be the correct one. But in the years of the First World War, watching destroyers hold their position while ships exploded around them, it felt to him like simple, observable truth. The physical demands of destroyer command in North Atlantic conditions were considerable and unrelenting. Cold was a constant, not the temporary cold of a winter morning, but the kind that crept into joints and settled there. The cold of weeks at sea, without adequate warmth or rest. The cold that made men slow and irritable and prone to the kinds of errors that cost lives. Halsey drove himself as hard as he drove his crews, sharing their discomfort not as a calculated gesture of solidarity, but because he was constitutionally incapable of separating himself from the physical reality of whatever environment he inhabited. He ate what they ate, endured what they endured, and expected in return a standard of performance that accepted no excuses and brooked no complacency. The men under his command discovered that his demands, while exacting, came attached to a genuine and unmistakable personal investment in their welfare. He would fight the system on their behalf with the same energy he brought to fighting the enemy, and in the culture of the destroyer fleet, that combination was both rare and electrifying. As the war progressed and Allied anti-submarine tactics began to improve, the convoy system eventually proving its worth beyond any reasonable doubt, the depth charge becoming a more effective weapon, the coordination between naval and air assets slowly tightening, Halsey found opportunities to translate his aggressive instincts into action at a tactical level. Destroyer commanders who pushed forward on a contact, who took their ships over where a submarine had last been detected and hammered the depth with charges rather than retreating to the safety of the convoy screen, were beginning to register results that the passive approach had not achieved. This suited Halsey perfectly. He was not interested in the clean, orderly geometry of convoy protection as an end in itself. He was interested in killing submarines, and increasingly, the evidence suggested that killing submarines required going after them rather than waiting for them to come to you. He was not alone among officers of his generation in drawing these lessons, but he drew them with a particular intensity and retained them with a particular permanence that would distinguish his later career. Other officers who served in destroyer escorts during the First World War returned to peacetime service and allowed the experience to settle into professional memory. One chapter among many in a naval career that moved through various assignments and roles. Halsey returned from the Atlantic carrying something that functioned less like a memory and more like a conviction, a hard, settled certainty about how war at sea should be conducted, that no subsequent assignment, no peacetime posting, no comfortable shore tour would be able to dissolve. The U-boat campaign had not given him a victory. It had given him something, in some ways, more durable, a framework for how aggressive men could and should approach an enemy that exploited hesitation. The armistice came in November of 1918, and with it came the particular deflation that afflicts fighting men when a war ends, before they have been given the opportunity to prove what they genuinely believe themselves capable of. Halsey had served with distinction. He had commanded well, maintained his ships, protected his convoys, and conducted himself in a manner that earned the respect of peers and superiors alike. But the great engagement, the crucible moment in which his philosophy of forward aggression would be tested at full scale against a sophisticated, determined enemy, that had not come. The war had ended in institutional compromise rather than dramatic naval decision, and whatever Halsey had expected to become in the fire of a major sea battle remained, at the armistice, a potential rather than an achievement. It was an uncomfortable condition for a man of his temperament. The years immediately after the war found him in the restless middle distance of peacetime naval service, competent, respected, professionally engaged, but carrying within him the sense of unfinished business that would become one of the defining qualities of his entire career. He was 40 years old when the guns fell silent over Europe. He had learned a great deal, proven a considerable amount, and demonstrated to anyone paying close attention the outline of the commander he was becoming. But the Pacific, the carrier, the island campaigns, the decisions that would make his name famous and infamous in equal measure, all of that lay ahead, waiting in a future he could not yet see, but which his entire formation had been preparing him to enter. The Atlantic had not finished him. It had, in the most precise sense, begun him, and a man like Halsey, hungry, certain, perpetually leaning forward into whatever came next, was only ever truly started, never truly finished. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not quiet with age. Most men, having reached their 50s with a respectable career behind them, begin to consolidate, to protect what they have built, rather than risk it on something entirely new. William Halsey was not most men. By the early 1930s, he had accumulated decades of sea time, a solid if unspectacular record, and the kind of institutional credibility that comes from outlasting lesser officers. He could have coasted on it. He could have accepted a comfortable shore posting, attended the right dinners, and retired with a handshake and a modest pension. Instead, he looked at the United States Navy and saw that everything he had learned about sea power was becoming obsolete, and he decided to start over. The catalyst was the carrier. Through the 1920s, the Navy had been quietly conducting an argument with itself about the future of naval warfare, and by the early part of the following decade, that argument was beginning to resolve. The battleship admirals, with their faith in armored gun platforms and long-range gunnery duels, were losing ground to a newer school of thought that pointed at the aircraft carrier and said, "This is how navies will fight from now on." Halsey had watched this debate from the outside, from the perspective of a surface warfare officer who understood destroyers and convoys and the brutal arithmetic of hull speed and torpedo range. But he was not too proud to acknowledge, when the evidence pointed somewhere he had not expected, the carrier represented a fundamentally different kind of reach, the ability to strike targets that no gun could touch, from positions that no enemy gunner could fix. To a man built around the idea of offensive action, it was irresistible. The problem was access. The Navy's rules at the time created a practical barrier between surface officers and the carrier commands Halsey now wanted. If you were going to command a carrier, the thinking went, you ought to understand aviation from the inside, not merely as a spectator, but as a practitioner. For younger officers, this meant completing flight training, earning their wings, and accumulating airtime alongside the aviators they would one day lead. For Halsey, who was already well past 50 when the full weight of this realization settled on him, it meant contemplating something that most of his contemporaries would have considered either admirable or insane, and probably both. Flight training at Pensacola was not designed for men of his age. It was designed for young men in their 20s, whose bodies were still forgiving, whose reflexes had not yet accumulated the minor frictions of middle age, whose vision was sharp enough to land a biplane on a pitching deck without the slow deliberation that comes with experience. He applied anyway, and the Navy, to its considerable credit, did not simply turn him away. There were conditions, there would always be conditions, but the path was opened, and in 1934, Halsey reported to the Naval Air Station at Pensacola, Florida, to begin the full training course, alongside men who were young enough, in some cases, to be his sons. The Florida heat was relentless. The curriculum demanded physical coordination, quick reflexes, and the willingness to accept that a machine can kill you with complete indifference to your rank or your record. Halsey threw himself into it with the same forward momentum he had applied to everything else in his career, and while it would be misleading to suggest the process was easy, it would be equally misleading to pretend it broke him. It did not break him, it changed him. What Pensacola gave Halsey was not merely a set of technical skills, though those were hard-won and genuine. It gave him something rarer and more durable, the aviator's particular understanding of what it feels like to be vulnerable in a way that surface sailors rarely experienced. On a destroyer, the ship around you is solid, institutional, collective. In a single-engine training aircraft, you are alone in a way that strips everything back to the essentials. You either have the aircraft under control or you do not. There is no committee to consult, no executive officer to pass the problem to. This quality, this confrontation with solitary, personal accountability, sharpened something in Halsey that his destroyer years had already begun to cut. He emerged from Pensacola with his wings and with a deepened conviction that the men he would one day command in the air deserved a leader who understood what they were being asked to do. He received his designation as a naval aviator in 1935, a fact that still reads as quietly remarkable against the broader backdrop of a service culture that rewarded specialization and institutional orthodoxy. The wings were more than a qualification. They were a statement of intent, a declaration that Halsey was willing to rebuild his professional identity at a stage in life when most officers were preparing to close accounts rather than open new ones. Word traveled through the Navy's officer corps in the way such things always travel, informally, with a mixture of raised eyebrows and genuine respect. Some of his contemporaries thought it was a stunt, a late career maneuver to secure a coveted command. Others understood it for what it was, a man reading the future with unusual clarity and placing himself inside it. The reward was substantial. With his wings earned and his aviator qualification secured, Halsey was now eligible for carrier command, and the Navy moved him toward it with the practical logic of an institution that suddenly had, in its senior ranks, one of the few officers who combined deep surface warfare experience with genuine aviation credentials. He received command of the carrier Saratoga, one of the Navy's great fleet carriers, converted from a battlecruiser hull and capable of operating dozens of aircraft from a flight deck that dwarfed anything Halsey had previously commanded. The Saratoga was not merely a large ship. She was a weapons system of a kind that barely had precedent, a floating airfield that could project air power at ranges and with a flexibility that the battleship admirals were still struggling to fully absorb. Command of the Saratoga was an education in itself. Halsey had to learn the rhythms of carrier operations from a position of authority, which meant learning them quickly, learning them publicly, and learning them while simultaneously earning the confidence of an air group whose members knew far more about their specific craft than he did. He managed this through the approach that had always served him best: direct, personal engagement with the men who actually flew the aircraft, an honest acknowledgement of what he still needed to learn, and an absolute refusal to pretend that command required omniscience rather than judgment. The aviators responded to this. They could identify a leader performing competence from a safe distance, and they could equally identify one who had genuinely invested himself in understanding their world. Halsey was the latter, and they knew it. From the Saratoga, his reputation in carrier aviation solidified quickly enough that further advancement followed in the logical sequence the Navy imposed on officers it had identified as future leaders of consequence. The elevation to command of Carrier Division 2 placed him above a unit of multiple carriers, not merely managing the operations of a single deck, but coordinating the combined striking power of a carrier group, thinking about aviation warfare at the operational rather than the tactical level. This was the layer of command where strategic instincts mattered as much as technical knowledge, where the question was not merely how to launch aircraft, but what targets to strike, in what sequence, with what combination of surprise and mass. For Halsey, who had been thinking about offensive action since his destroyer days, this was natural territory. He adapted to it with a speed that surprised observers who had expected the late arrival of aviation to leave permanent gaps in his professional foundation. The naval world Halsey was moving through in the second half of the 1930s was changing at a rate that left little room for stagnation. Japan was expanding aggressively across the Pacific and into China, and American naval planners were working through the uncomfortable mathematics of what a war in that ocean might require. The distances involved, the logistics of sustaining fleet operations across thousands of kilometers of open water, the question of whether the Navy's carrier force was large enough, experienced enough, and organized correctly to carry out the offensive missions that war plans envisioned. Halsey sat inside these conversations with a perspective that very few officers could claim. He had served in the old Navy of the pre-carrier era, and he had reinvented himself inside the new one. He understood both what had been left behind and what was being built in its place. There was also something about the act of reinvention itself, the willingness to sit in a classroom as a 50-something officer, surrounded by men half his age, to accept instruction, to risk failure in front of a junior cohort, that had an effect on how Halsey was perceived throughout the service. The Navy watched its officers closely, and what it saw in Halsey's decision to pursue aviation was not the desperation of a man scrambling for relevance, but the confidence of a man secure enough in his own identity to change it. That distinction mattered. It said something about the quality of his judgment and the steadiness of his character that would prove far more important than any single tactical decision once the war he was preparing for finally began. By the time the decade closed and the shadow of open conflict moved from the distant and theoretical to the uncomfortably near, Halsey stood in a position that would have been difficult to predict from the middling cadet he had been at Annapolis, or the restless destroyer captain he had been after the First World War. He was, at last, the right man, in the right place, with the right preparation, and the worst crisis in American naval history was already gathering, just beyond the horizon. He had been at sea when the world changed. That fact alone would follow William Halsey for the rest of his life. The strange, uncomfortable grace of having been in exactly the wrong place to die and exactly the right place to survive. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, his task force was somewhere out in the broad Pacific, well to the west of the Hawaiian Islands, having delivered a consignment of marine fighter aircraft toward Wake Island. The ships were pushing through heavy swells, their crews going about the particular routines of men who have been at sea long enough to stop noticing the ocean beneath them. There was no particular urgency. There was no warning that had reached them. And then the radio brought a message that none of them were prepared to hear, and the morning became something else entirely. The news of Pearl Harbor arrived not as a formal transmission, but with the raw, fractured quality of chaos still in progress. Reports were incomplete, contradictory, and in some respects almost impossible to believe, not because the men receiving them lacked imagination, but because the scale of what had happened resisted any single mind's attempt to contain it. Japanese aircraft had struck the fleet in its anchorage. Battleships were sinking or already gone. The air station at Wheeler Field was burning. The attack had come at 7:30 in the morning, local time, when most of the fleet was still at breakfast or sleeping in. And at this moment, Halsey's carriers, the very ships that the Japanese had been hoping to destroy, were nowhere near Pearl Harbor. They were at sea, they were untouched, and Halsey himself was standing on a bridge that should, by any rational military calculus, have been the Japanese High Command's first priority. What Halsey felt in those first minutes and hours has been described in several ways by the men who were near him. What is consistent across every account is that it was not confusion. It was not the paralysis of shock that gripped so many officers and officials who received that same news from a safer distance. What came over Halsey was fury, immediate, total, and in certain respects clarifying. He had spent years building a philosophy of forward aggression, of finding the enemy and closing the distance before the enemy closed it first. He had watched the Navy debate and delay and consider, And now the enemy had closed the distance in the most devastating possible manner, on a quiet Sunday morning, against men who were eating and sleeping and doing nothing to deserve what arrived out of the sky above them. The anger that rose in Halsey was not irrational, but it was the kind of anger that, in a man who also commanded ships and made decisions, required careful watching. His task force turned toward Pearl Harbor. As the ships came in, the evidence of what had happened assembled itself piece by piece, first on the radio, then in the thickening smell of fuel oil and smoke that reached the fleet long before the harbor itself was visible. Men on deck strained toward the horizon and saw the sky over Oahu tinged with a quality of light that had no good explanation. Then they entered the harbor, and the explanation was everywhere. The battleship row was a scene of wreckage, on a scale that seemed to belong to some other, more terrible kind of war than the one the Navy had been planning for. Ships that had been the pride of the Pacific Fleet sat at catastrophic angles in the water, or were gone beneath it entirely, or were still burning with a slow, determined persistence that suggested the fires had settled in for the duration. The dry dock facilities, the fuel storage areas, the aircraft that had been caught on the ground. The damage was not merely tactical, it was psychological. It was meant to demonstrate something about the distance between American assumptions and Japanese capability, and it had done its work very effectively. Halsey walked through what he found at Pearl Harbor and did not go quiet with grief in the way that some men did. He went loud. He made statements to the officers around him that were blunt, profane, and stripped of the diplomatic caution that senior rank usually imposes on a man's public expression. Some of those statements were later repeated, paraphrased, and in some cases embellished, until they took on a life separate from anything he might actually have said. But the underlying sentiment was not invented by anyone. He wanted to fight. He wanted to fight immediately. He said so to anyone who had the authority to authorize it. And he said so in terms that left no ambiguity about the depth or sincerity of his conviction. In a command environment suddenly dominated by the question of how bad the damage was and how long recovery would take, Halsey was already asking a different question. Where were the Japanese carriers, and how soon could American ships reach them? The Navy's senior leadership in the days after the 7th of December was not indifferent to aggression, but it was also not ready for it. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet commander whose career would be consumed by the disaster, was in the process of being relieved. The fleet was conducting damage assessments, rescuing survivors, guarding against a follow-up strike that many feared was imminent. The institutional response to Pearl Harbor was shock, followed by bureaucratic urgency. An enormous amount of energy poured into counting what had been lost and shoring up what remained. Halsey understood all of this. He also found it, on some level, intolerable. The battleships were gone, but the carriers were not. The carriers were at sea, intact, fueled, and crewed by men who had just watched their home port turned into a graveyard. Halsey's argument was not complicated. Use what you have, right now, and take the war back to the enemy, before the enemy can interpret American stillness as fear. There were those in the Navy who found his urgency dangerous, rather than inspiring. They were not wrong to worry. The same instincts that made Halsey insist on offensive action in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor were also the instincts that would, at their worst, lead him into decisions made at full speed with insufficient information. The anger was real, and it was useful, and it was also, in its purest form, a kind of blindness, a refusal to let caution have any voice at all in the room where decisions were being made. Some of his staff had already learned to watch for the moments when the fury became something other than focus, when it became a compression of all nuance into a single demand for forward motion, regardless of what the forward motion was moving toward. Pearl Harbor gave Halsey's anger its permanent justification. And permanent justifications, for a man like him, were never entirely safe. His name began to spread through the fleet in the weeks following the attack, in a way that names sometimes spread in militaries under pressure, as a symbol before the reality can fully follow. Sailors who had never seen his face or served under his command knew who he was. They knew he was the admiral whose carriers had been at sea. They knew he had come back to the burning harbor and demanded to fight. In the specific, damaged psychology of the Pacific Fleet in December of 1941, a force that had been humiliated on the first morning of its war and was now being asked to continue that war with a fraction of the power it had possessed 24 hours earlier. The knowledge that someone at the flag level wanted to go forward rather than backward was worth something that cannot be measured in tonnage or aircraft or sortie rates. It was worth the feeling that the war was not already over. His survival on that 7th of December was not something Halsey chose or planned or earned. He had simply been ordered to ferry aircraft to Wake Island rather than remain at Pearl Harbor, and Japanese timing had done the rest. But there is a particular weight that attaches itself to the men who are not present at catastrophes they might have shared, and Halsey carried that weight in his own way, not through survivor's guilt in any recognizable therapeutic sense, but through an escalation of purpose that left almost no room for anything else. The men who had died in the harbor were not abstract casualties in some ledger. They were sailors, and he had spent his entire career among sailors, and the idea that they had been caught in their anchorage on a quiet Sunday morning by an enemy who had flown out of a sunrise and gone home to a fleet that was still intact, that idea did not sit quietly in Halsey. It burned. The weeks between Pearl Harbor and the first American offensive operations of the war were weeks in which Halsey was in constant motion, meeting with staff, reviewing intelligence, pushing against every constraint that suggested the fleet needed more time before it could strike. He was not the only voice arguing for early action, but he was the loudest and the most insistent, and he had behind him the moral weight of the carrier task force that had survived when so much else had not. The argument he made was fundamentally simple. The Japanese had demonstrated what waiting looked like. Waiting at anchor, waiting to be ready, waiting for the conditions to be perfect. Waiting had given the enemy its opening, and more waiting would only give it more. The answer to Pearl Harbor was not preparation. The answer was motion. And Halsey had always believed that a fleet in motion, even an imperfect fleet with incomplete intelligence and uncertain odds, was more dangerous than any fleet sitting still, waiting for certainty to arrive. What Pearl Harbor made of William Halsey, in the end, was not something entirely new. It accelerated what was already there: the aggression, the fury, the contempt for caution, the bone-deep conviction that the worst thing a commander could do was hesitate. The harbor full of sunken ships gave all of that a focus and a fuel it had never quite had before. In the months that followed, when Halsey would lead the first offensive operations of the American Naval War, the impulse behind every order he gave traced a line back to that December morning, to the smell of burning oil coming across the water, to the sight of the battleship Roe, to the decision he made standing among the wreckage, that whatever else he did, in whatever time remained to him, he was not going to wait. The Pacific Fleet that greeted the new year of 1942 was a broken thing. Undin. 7 battleships had been sunk or put out of action at Pearl Harbor. The airfields at Hickam and Wheeler had been torn apart. The fuel storage facilities, by some miracle, had survived, and so had the repair yards. But the psychological wound cut deeper than any of the physical damage. Across the naval base, men worked through December and into January with the particular grim determination of those who have been humiliated in front of the world and are not yet sure how to answer for it. The fleet's senior leadership moved carefully, cautiously, measuring each decision against the terrifying possibility of losing what little remained. And into that atmosphere of careful calculation walked William Halsey, returning from sea with his carriers intact and his anger at a temperature that made caution feel like a foreign language. He understood, with a clarity that cut through institutional hesitation, that the worst thing the Navy could do was wait. The Japanese were advancing across the Pacific on multiple fronts simultaneously, sweeping through the Philippines, driving into Malaya, pushing toward the Dutch East Indies, and every week of American passivity allowed them to consolidate, to fortify, to build the defensive perimeter that would make any eventual counteroffensive vastly more expensive in blood and time. Halsey's argument to Admiral husband Kimmel, and then to Kimmel's replacement, Admiral Chester Nimitz, was not sophisticated in its strategic architecture. It was blunt. The fleet had to move. It had to be seen to move. The country needed to know that the Navy had not simply sunk to its knees and was waiting for the killing blow. And the only way to demonstrate that was to put carriers within range of Japanese-held territory and hit something. Nimitz, himself a man who preferred decisive action to prolonged deliberation, agreed. Halsey was given his orders. The target was the Marshall and Gilbert Island chains, a sprawling collection of atolls and coral outcroppings deep in the Central Pacific that Japan had held under a League of Nations mandate since the First World War and had spent years quietly fortifying. American intelligence on what exactly was present on those islands was fragmentary at best. There were Japanese garrisons, certainly. There were aircraft, almost certainly. There were shore batteries and installations of some kind, but the precise disposition, the numbers, the strength, all of that was more guess than knowledge. Halsey was being asked to strike into something approaching a void, with carriers that represented almost the entirety of American offensive capability in the Pacific, against defenses that could, for all anyone knew, be formidable enough to seriously damage or destroy what he was bringing. He took the assignment without visible hesitation. His task force headed west, maintaining radio silence, crossing the miles of open ocean that separated the Hawaiian Islands from whatever was waiting for them at their objective. The raids came in early February of 1942, hitting multiple atolls across the Marshall and Gilbert chains in a series of coordinated strikes that Halsey drove forward with his characteristic insistence on pressing every advantage. His aircraft went in against airfields, against shipping in the lagoons, against port installations, and whatever military infrastructure they could locate and reach. The opposition was real. Japanese aircraft rose to intercept. Anti-aircraft fire came up from the shore installations, and Halsey's ships did not emerge from the operation untouched. Enterprise herself took a bomb hit that required repair, and the raids cost American aircraft and aircrew in numbers that were painful to absorb given how few could be replaced in the short term. But what the strikes achieved in exchange for those losses was something that could not be measured in aircraft destroyed, or ships damaged, or fuel dumps set alight. They proved, in the most direct way imaginable, that the Pacific Fleet could still reach out and touch the enemy. Back home, the effect was immediate and striking in its scale. America in the first weeks of 1942 was a country absorbing an almost unbroken sequence of terrible news. The fall of Wake Island, the siege of Bataan, the humiliation of British forces at Singapore, the sense that the entire Pacific world was collapsing toward Japanese control with nothing to stop it. Against that backdrop of catastrophe, the news that American carriers had struck Japanese-held islands landed like something from a different war entirely. Here, suddenly, was the Navy attacking rather than defending. Here was an American fleet that had found a way to bring the fight to an enemy that had seemed, just weeks earlier, to be operating on some higher level of military capability that the United States could not match. The public response was hunger, an urgent, almost desperate enthusiasm for this particular story, this particular face. That face was Halsey's. The Navy's public affairs machinery understood immediately what it had in him. He was not a man who gave measured, carefully worded statements to the press. He was a man who said exactly what he thought, in language that any working American could recognize, whose expressions of contempt for the enemy were vivid enough to be quotable and confident enough to be believed. His photograph, the broad jaw, the set eyes, the expression of a man who has already decided the argument is over, ran in newspapers and on magazine covers across the country. He was profiled, celebrated, held up as proof that American fighting spirit had not been extinguished at Pearl Harbor, but had merely been looking for a direction to move. In an era when military figures were often obscured behind institutional anonymity, Halsey was bracingly, almost dangerously present. He was what people needed to believe the war could be won. The raids continued through the early months of 1942. Halsey struck again, pushing his task force toward targets in the Central Pacific with a rhythm that refused to let the Japanese settle or feel secure behind their new perimeter. Each operation carried its own specific risks. The possibility of submarine interception during the approach, the ever-present danger of meeting Japanese carrier forces that might be repositioning after Pearl Harbor, the mechanical stress that continuous high-speed operations imposed on ships that had been designed for endurance, but not for this relentless pace. His staff worked the problems, his captains executed with precision, and Halsey himself maintained the forward pressure that kept the whole enterprise moving. There was a quality to his leadership in these months that his crews recognized and responded to, a sense that the man at the top of the chain believed completely in what they were doing, and that belief was itself a form of protection against doubt. For the Navy's senior leadership, watching from Pearl Harbor and Washington, the carrier raids produced a more complicated set of responses. The operations demonstrated something that some senior officers had doubted and others had resisted acknowledging, that carrier aviation could function as the primary offensive instrument of naval power, striking targets far beyond the range of any surface fleet, shaping the battle before the first surface gun was fired. The battleship admirals who had dominated American naval thinking for decades had watched their crown jewels settle into the mud of Pearl Harbor, and they had mostly assumed that the war would need to wait until those vessels could be raised and returned to service. Halsey's raids offered a different argument. The carriers were not a substitute for the battleships while the real fleet recovered. The carriers were the real fleet. That argument would take time to win completely within the institution, but Halsey's operations across those early months gave it a force and a credibility that nothing else could have provided. His men, for their part, developed in these months something that transcended ordinary loyalty to a commanding officer. Halsey had a quality that experienced sailors could read in the way a man carried himself on a bridge, in the decisions he made under pressure, in the way he treated the enlisted men he encountered during his walks through the ship. He remembered names. He asked questions that demonstrated he understood what the work actually required of the people doing it. He expressed his anger at the enemy and his faith in his crews with equal directness, and neither sentiment ever felt like performance. The men who served under him in those first desperate months of the Pacific War would speak of those operations for the rest of their lives with a particular kind of pride, not just pride in what they had done, but pride in who had led them doing it. The tactical modesty of what was actually achieved deserves its honest accounting. The Marshall and Gilbert raids did not significantly degrade Japanese military capability. The installations struck were repaired. The aircraft destroyed were replaced. The garrison troops absorbed the attacks and remained in place. When historians would later measure the raids against the scale of what was coming in the Pacific War, the massive carrier battles, the great amphibious campaigns, the final assault on the Japanese home islands, the operations of early 1942 would appear almost preliminary, almost tentative, the first hesitant chords of something that would eventually become an immense orchestration of violence and logistics. But measuring them only by the physical damage they inflicted misses everything important about what they were and what they did. They were the Navy, reaching into itself for something it was not certain it still had, and finding it there. What Halsey understood, with an instinct that operated below the level of formal strategic analysis, was that the early months of any war are fought in the imagination as much as on any physical terrain. The stories a nation tells itself about what it can do and what its enemies can do are not mere propaganda. They shape recruitment, they shape production, they shape the willingness of fighting men to step forward into uncertainty. A fleet that spent the first year of the war in harbor, waiting to be rebuilt, would lose something that could not be restored by any number of new ships. The habit of moving forward, the expectation of offensive action, the belief that the enemy could be struck no matter where he had positioned himself. These were qualities that had to be exercised continuously, or they would atrophy. Halsey was exercising them. Every time he brought his task force back to Pearl Harbor, having accomplished something, having struck somewhere, having refused to accept that the initiative belonged permanently to the other side, he was building the institutional reflexes that the fleet would need when the genuinely decisive moments came. By the spring of 1942, his face was on the front page of magazines that sat on kitchen tables in every state in the country. His name had become a kind of shorthand for aggression, for defiance, for the specific American quality of meeting disaster by looking for whoever caused it and going directly toward them. The gap between the public legend and the operational reality was already present, already being carefully tended by a navy that understood the value of having a face for the war. But the legend was not entirely constructed. The man who had charged into the Marshall Islands with incomplete intelligence and irreplaceable ships, who had accepted real risk for real purpose, who had brought his carriers home and immediately begun planning the next operation, that man existed. He was not invented. He was simply also more complicated than any magazine cover could contain, and the complications were waiting patiently in the future, accumulating quietly behind the image of the Pacific's most famous fighting admiral. The Pacific, in the spring of 1942, was a sea of contradictions. American sailors moved across its surface with purpose, yet underneath that purpose ran a current of humiliation that no communique could quite disguise. Pearl Harbor had happened fewer than 5 months before, and despite the early carrier raids that Halsey had pushed through the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, those bold, necessary gestures toward a fighting future, the fundamental equation of the Pacific War remained brutally unfavorable. Japan held the initiative, Japan held the islands, and Japan, in the minds of many across the world, held something more dangerous than territory, the belief that her armed forces were untouchable on their home ground. It would take something extraordinary to crack that belief, not a battle won on points, something visceral, something that would reach into the Japanese homeland itself and announce, in unmistakable terms, that no corner of this war was beyond American reach. The idea that would become the Doolittle Raid arrived through channels that mixed desperation with ingenuity. At its core was a question that had occupied American planners since December of 1941. Could Army Air Force's bombers, too large to land back on a carrier deck, be launched from one anyway? The answer was yes, just barely, and the man chosen to prove it was Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a former air racing champion and aeronautical engineer, whose combination of physical daring and technical precision made him uniquely suited to command an operation that had no precedent and no safety margin. 16 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers were loaded onto the flight deck of the carrier Hornet in complete secrecy, their crews briefed on a mission that most of them only partially understood until the morning it was launched. Halsey's task force, designated Task Force 16, would escort the Hornet within range of the Japanese coast. What happened after the bombers left the deck was in the hands of Doolittle, his crews, and whatever fortune remained available to them. Halsey understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent decades reading weather and water, exactly what the risks of this operation were. The plan called for the Hornet to approach within roughly 450 to 500 kilometers of the Japanese coast before launching, close enough to give the B-25s a fighting chance of reaching their targets, hitting them, and then flying onto land at airfields in nationalist China. The window of survivability was narrow. The calculations left almost no room for error in navigation, fuel consumption, or enemy contact. Halsey had spent the early carrier raids of 1942, proving that aggressive action could be conducted without recklessness, that boldness and calculation were not opposites. This mission tested that belief more severely than anything he had yet attempted, because it was not merely his ships and his sailors at risk. He was carrying another service's men toward a shore he could not protect them from, and he knew it. The task force moved west across the Pacific, under strict radio silence, every transmission suppressed, every light aboard the ships reduced to the minimum the safety of navigation required. The Hornet's deck was crowded with the B-25s, their olive-green fuselages incongruous against the gray of the carrier's steel, visible proof that something new was being attempted. Doolittle's crews ran final checks, studied maps of targets they had memorized in briefings conducted far from any ears that might carry word back to Tokyo. The deeper into the Pacific they sailed, the more the mission took on the quality of a controlled fall, a commitment made before the full consequences could be seen. Halsey kept his doubts, if he had them, to himself. His crews needed a commander who radiated certainty, and whatever private calculations he was running, the face he showed was the face of a man who had already decided that this mission would succeed. Then, in the early hours of the 18th of April, 1942, a Japanese picket vessel appeared. These small patrol boats were stationed in a picket line, extending far out to sea, their purpose precisely this: to provide early warning of an approaching enemy force. One of them had found the task force, or the task force had found it, and the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that a radio message had almost certainly gone out, or would go out, within minutes. The careful geography of the plan, the calculated distance, the launch point designed to give the crews their best possible chance, collapsed in an instant. They were still more than 300 kilometers further from Japan than the plan had intended. At that range, flying to their targets and then continuing on to China would stretch the fuel carried by each B-25 to the absolute edge of possibility, and perhaps beyond it. Halsey did not hesitate. The order went to the Hornet, and within the hour, the first B-25 was rolling down the flight deck into a headwind that lifted it, improbably, into the grey morning sky. What makes this moment so revealing of the man is not simply that he decided to launch, it is the nature of what that decision contained. He was accepting, in full awareness, that the increased distance made it likely that some or all of the crews would not make it to China. bail out over the ocean, capture, death. These were outcomes he had just made significantly more probable with a single command. Halsey was not careless with lives. His sailors knew him as a commander who felt losses personally, who visited wounded men in hospital, who remembered names. But he understood, as he understood almost nothing else so completely, that war does not preserve the option of a clean choice. The choice here was between a mission launched under terrible conditions and a mission that was never launched at all. The 16 bombers climbed one after another from the Hornet's pitching deck into a sky that offered them nothing beyond the horizon they were pointed toward. Doolittle led them west. Halsey turned his task force east, back toward the relative safety of open ocean, and the two forces separated, one element retreating, one pressing forward, both necessary to the same purpose. On the bridges of the withdrawing ships, officers and sailors followed the departing aircraft with their eyes as long as the planes remained visible, which was not long. Then there was nothing ahead but open water, and nothing behind but the question of what was happening in the skies above Japan. The bombers reached Tokyo and the other target cities in the early afternoon, dropping their loads from low altitude in a raid that lasted minutes and caused damage that, measured in the cold arithmetic of strategic effect, was modest. Factories were not destroyed. Infrastructure was not crippled. The military calculus of bomb tonnage to outcome would not have impressed anyone reviewing it in isolation. But the raid was never primarily about the bombs. It was about the message that those bombs carried, which was a message no military planner could quantify, that the Japanese home islands were not a sanctuary, that the war had dimensions that Tokyo's strategic planners had chosen not to account for, and that American forces possessed both the ingenuity and the will to reach places they were not supposed to be able to reach. The shock that ran through Japanese civilian and military society in the hours and days after the raid was not proportional to the damage. It was proportional to the idea. Most of Doolittle's crews survived, though not all by the routes they had hoped for. Some landed in China as planned, aided by local populations at enormous personal risk. Others came down in Soviet territory and were interned. A small number were captured by Japanese forces in China and faced treatment that belonged among the darkest chapters of the war in Asia. Doolittle himself, landing safely in China, believed for a time that the operation had been a failure, that the loss of the aircraft, none of which could be recovered, would be judged too high a cost. He was wrong, though it took him time to understand why. Roosevelt, asked publicly where the bombers had come from, deflected with a smile, and named Shangri-La, the fictional Himalayan paradise from a popular novel. The secrecy that had shrouded the operation held, for a while. What unfolded in the weeks that followed was more strategically significant than the raid itself. Imperial Japanese planners, shaken by the reach that American carriers had demonstrated, drew a conclusion that Halsey and the architects of the mission had hoped they would draw, that the defensive perimeter needed to be extended, that aircraft carriers posed a threat that could not be tolerated at any range, that the American carrier fleet needed to be found and destroyed before it could execute another such humiliation. This reasoning led directly to the Japanese operation targeting Midway Island, a complex, overextended offensive designed to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle and annihilate it. The logic was sound. The execution would prove catastrophic for Japan, as would become clear in the first days of June 1942. The Doolittle Raid did not cause Midway, but it created the conditions of urgency and wounded pride that made the Japanese overreach feel necessary to those who ordered it. For Halsey personally, the mission was one of the cleaner chapters of a career that would grow steadily more complicated. He had taken a plan that required him to carry another service's men toward an outcome he could not guarantee, made the hardest possible call at the hardest possible moment, and turned away without knowing for certain whether any of those men would survive. That kind of command requires a particular ability to inhabit uncertainty, to make a decision and then live with the space that opens up after the decision is made. Halsey had that ability, sometimes to his great credit, and sometimes, as later chapters of his career would make plain, to his cost. In April of 1942, it served him well. The bombers flew, the bombs fell. And somewhere in the shift of calculations that followed in Tokyo's planning rooms, the course of the Pacific War bent, just slightly, but unmistakably, in a direction that would eventually lead an American fleet to victory at Midway, a victory that Halsey himself would not be present to share, for reasons that had nothing to do with the enemy, and everything to do with the limits of a human body, pushed beyond what even the most determined will could sustain. By the late spring of 1942, Admiral William Halsey had become the most visible symbol of American naval resistance in the Pacific. His face appeared in magazines and newspapers across the country, and his name was spoken by sailors and civilians alike as shorthand for the fighting spirit the nation needed to believe still burned within its navy. The early carrier raids he had orchestrated, the attacks on the Marshall Islands, the strikes into the Gilbert Chain, had not inflicted grave strategic damage on the Japanese, but they had accomplished something equally important in those dark months after Pearl Harbor. They had proven that America could strike back. Halsey had given the American people a hero when they desperately needed one, a man whose very presence seemed to radiate defiance. Yet in the spring of 1942, even as his legend was crystallizing, his body was beginning to betray him in ways that would strip away all the trappings of command and leave him utterly helpless at the most consequential moment of the war's first year. The illness that would hospitalize Halsey struck him without warning, a severe and debilitating skin condition that erupted across his body with agonizing intensity. The exact nature of the affliction remains medically imprecise in the historical record. Dermatitis is the diagnosis recorded, but the full scope of what he suffered was far more than a superficial irritation. The itching was relentless and maddening, the kind of constant torment that erodes the will and consumes the mind, and it spread across large portions of his body until basic functions became torture. The condition was severe enough that medical officers at Pearl Harbor could no longer recommend his continued service at sea, not because of any fundamental threat to his life, but because the pain and distraction had become incompatible with the demands of fleet command. In May of 1942, while the Japanese Navy was preparing its next major operation in the Central Pacific, Halsey was admitted to a Navy hospital where he would remain for weeks, removed entirely from the chain of command that was rushing toward a confrontation that would reshape the entire war. The timing of his illness was almost cruelly strategic, as if fate itself had decided to test whether Halsey's aggressive philosophy could survive when stripped of the man himself. The Japanese had lost the carriers Lexington and Coral Sea in the battle fought at the beginning of May, and they had lost the cream of their naval aviator corps in engagements that had cost them pilots they could never fully replace. Yet they remained convinced that they possessed the capacity to achieve a decisive victory through one more major operation, and they began preparing to strike at Midway Island, a small American atoll sitting astride the Central Pacific, roughly halfway between the American mainland and Hawaii. The plan was audacious in its conception and economical in its ambition. Destroy the remaining American carriers in a single concentrated engagement, and the Pacific would belong to Japan for a generation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was now orchestrating this new operation with meticulous precision, committing 4 fleet carriers, a second wave force, and an enormous complement of supporting ships to ensure success, where the initial assault on Pearl Harbor had failed to eliminate American naval power entirely. For Halsey, watching this drama unfold from a hospital bed was a form of torture more acute than any physical suffering his skin condition could inflict.
He received reports of Japanese movements, of the deployment orders being issued for the American response, of the preparations underway at Pearl Harbor to position the fleet for the battle that everyone now expected.
Every message that reached him carried the implicit weight of exclusion. The Navy was going to fight the battle of the century without him, and he would not even be present to observe it from a distance. The command of his task force, now officially designated Task Force 16, and built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, was reassigned to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man Halsey respected professionally, but hardly knew on a personal basis. Spruance was methodical, where Halsey was aggressive, cautious, where Halsey was bold, and he had spent most of the war in administrative and planning positions, rather than in direct command at sea. To Halsey, the choice felt like an abandonment of the very philosophy that had kept the American Navy fighting when it had every reason to surrender to despair. Spruance, however, was exactly the right man for the moment, though neither he nor anyone else could have known it in advance. He possessed an intellect of rare clarity, an ability to absorb complex intelligence about enemy positions and movements, and translate that information into tactical decisions with ruthless logic. He had the capacity to resist the siren call of aggressive action when circumstances did not warrant it, to maintain composure under conditions of incomplete information, and to recognize the difference between calculated risk and reckless gambling. These qualities would prove to be the very attributes most necessary for the battle that lay ahead. Yet they were precisely the attributes that Halsey's personality and command philosophy tended to subordinate to the imperative of forward momentum. The Navy's most senior leadership recognized, perhaps half-consciously, that Midway would not be won by the admiral who attacked most ferociously, but by the admiral who made the most lethal use of imperfect information and fragmented intelligence. Spruance's appointment was not a rebuke to Halsey's aggression, so much as a recognition that different moments in war demand different kinds of command. As June approached, and the American fleet began to position itself for the engagement that American codebreakers had already confirmed was coming, Halsey's frustration reached almost unbearable levels. He was receiving briefings on the disposition of Japanese forces, the location of enemy carriers, the tactical options available to American forces, and each briefing only deepened his sense of having been robbed of the moment for which his entire career had been preparation. Spruance was preparing to fight the battle under conditions of almost perfect intelligence advantage. American codebreakers had provided such detailed information about Japanese movements that Spruance would know the approximate location of the enemy fleet even before the first reconnaissance aircraft spotted them. The playing field had been leveled by American cryptanalysis, and the Japanese advantage in experienced pilots and large fleet carriers had been negated before the first shot was fired. Yet none of this was Halsey's doing, and none of it would restore to him what his body had stolen, the chance to prove himself in the greatest naval engagement of the 20th century. The Battle of Midway, fought across the 3rd, 4th, and 5th of June 1942, unfolded almost exactly as Spruance had anticipated, with American dive bombers striking at the Japanese carriers with lethal precision and transforming what had seemed like a catastrophic engagement into a stunning American victory. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sunk, along with hundreds of aircraft and thousands of trained pilots whose loss the Japanese Navy would feel for the remainder of the war. The battle did not end the war in the Pacific, and it did not grant America immediate naval supremacy, but it shifted the balance of probabilities in a fundamental way. From June of 1942 onward, Japan was fighting a war it could no longer win, defending territory against an enemy whose industrial capacity was unlimited and whose technological innovation would only accelerate. Spruance had fought exactly the battle that Midway required: patient, methodical, ruthless, and perfectly calibrated to the intelligence available to him. The victory was total and undisputed, and it belonged to a man whose appointment Halsey had not made, and whose decision-making process bore almost no resemblance to Halsey's own command philosophy. For Halsey, lying in his hospital bed and receiving the reports of American victory, the emotional landscape was contradictory and tormented. On one level, he felt the pride of a naval officer whose service branch had achieved the greatest naval victory in American history, who could take comfort in knowing that the war was not lost and that American determination had paid dividends in blood and sacrifice. Yet, on another level, he felt the sharp sting of exclusion, the knowledge that the most consequential moment of his professional life had occurred without him, that history had moved on, and that his absence at the moment of triumph could not be erased by any future action. Spruance had done what Halsey had been preparing to do, and he had done it better than Halsey likely would have, and that fact was almost unbearable to accept. The psychological weight of this realization would remain with Halsey for the remainder of his life, never fully articulated, but always present beneath the surface of his public confidence and his celebrated aggression. The weeks that followed Midway were a period of slow, agonizing recovery for Halsey. The skin condition that had hospitalized him did not immediately release its grip, and his medical team moved cautiously through various treatments, trying remedies, and waiting for improvement that came slowly and unevenly. His immobility forced him to confront his own dependence in a way that his earlier life had never required, to accept medical advice and instructions with the obedience of a patient, rather than the authority of an admiral. This forced posture of submission was psychologically painful in ways that his physical suffering could not fully capture, and it reinforced a lesson that Halsey had never truly internalized, that even the strongest will and most aggressive spirit cannot overcome the fragility of the human body. He spent the summer of 1942 in a state of enforced convalescence, reading reports of the war he could not fight, receiving visitors whose pity was barely concealed beneath their congratulations about his eventual recovery, and contemplating what would be left of his career and his reputation when he finally returned to active command. As his condition gradually improved through June and July, Halsey's thoughts turned increasingly toward the future and the question of where he would fit into the Navy's plans for the remainder of the war. The South Pacific was becoming an arena of increasing activity and importance, with the American commitment to liberate the Solomon Islands and neutralize the massive Japanese base at Rabaul, gathering momentum and resources. The Guadalcanal campaign would begin in August of 1942, and it would immediately develop into a grinding war of attrition, unlike anything the Navy had experienced in the opening months of the war. Halsey would eventually be assigned to command in this theater, but in the summer of 1942, still recovering and rebuilding his strength, he could not have known that vindication and purpose still awaited him. What he knew was only that he had been absent at the moment when his presence might have made a difference, that someone else had won the victory that might have been his, and that the remainder of the war would have to prove whether his particular blend of aggression and determination had any place in a conflict that seemed increasingly shaped by the virtues of patience and calculation. The months of Halsey's illness and recovery marked a profound turning point in his self-understanding, though he would never fully acknowledge it. He had entered 1942 as a man whose confidence in his own tactical and strategic judgment was absolute and unquestioned, whose aggressive instincts had been vindicated by the early successes of the carrier raids he had orchestrated. Yet, by the end of the summer, he had been forced to witness a greater victory achieved by a man whose methods and temperament were almost opposite to his own. Spruance's victory at Midway did not disprove Halsey's philosophy of aggressive action, but it did suggest that aggression alone was insufficient, that circumstances sometimes demanded something else entirely. Halsey would carry this lesson forward, though he would never fully absorb it or allow it to fundamentally alter his command style. The man who emerged from hospitalization in the late summer of 1942 was the same Halsey who had entered. Yet, he was also subtly changed, more aware of his own limitations, more conscious of forces beyond his control, and burning with a determination to prove that his exclusion from Midway did not represent a verdict on his capacity to lead and win. The experience of illness and powerlessness created in Halsey a profound respect for the men under his command in ways that success alone might never have accomplished. He had been forced to depend upon medical officers and nurses for his most basic needs, had been reduced to a patient waiting for recovery rather than a commander directing operations, and that humbling experience deepened his understanding of what his sailors endured. When he returned to active command in the autumn of 1942, he carried with him not only his legendary aggression, but also a new awareness of the cost of command, of the weight of decisions that sent other men into danger, of the fragility that lay beneath every uniform and every symbol of rank. This combination of aggressive determination and hard-won humility would define his command in the South Pacific, and would shape the legacy he left behind for subsequent generations of naval officers. The man who had been stripped of command by illness and disease would emerge from that experience not diminished, but transformed, ready to engage in the grinding campaign that awaited him, and to prove that even his absence at Midway could not erase his essential contribution to the American victory in the Pacific. The autumn of 1942 brought the Pacific War to a precipice. 6 months of fighting on Guadalcanal had cost the American Navy 5 cruisers and 14 destroyers. The Japanese had lost more tonnage, yet they showed no signs of withdrawing. They were pouring reinforcements down the slot, that narrow waterway between the islands they called the Tokyo Express, night after night, landing fresh troops and supplies, while American commanders in the South Pacific were left with the agonizing responsibility of deciding which fights they could afford and which they could not. By October, Guadalcanal had become not a symbol of American determination, but a symbol of something far more troubling, a campaign balanced on a knife's edge between triumph and catastrophe, with the outcome entirely uncertain. At Pearl Harbor and at other commands, senior American admirals were beginning to wonder whether the Marine garrison on that island could hold at all. The man assigned to oversee this deteriorating situation was Vice Admiral Robert Gormley. He was a capable officer, respected for his professionalism and his careful attention to logistics. He had spent months building the command infrastructure for the South Pacific, moving supply ships and ammunition, coordinating with commanders ashore and at sea. But by the summer of 1942, Gormley had grown increasingly worn down by the relentless arithmetic of attrition. His reports to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor took on a darker tone. The Japanese, he warned, had superiority in night-fighting tactics. American ships were being lost faster than replacements could arrive. Supplies were thin, Morale among the men was fragmenting under the weight of casualty lists that arrived almost daily. Gormley had begun to sound, to those who read his dispatches carefully, like a man who believed the campaign might already be lost. In the minds of some officers, he had begun to sound like a commander waiting for permission to give up. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, faced a decision that was as much political as it was military. Removing a senior commander mid-campaign was a severe act, one that invited questions about judgment and planning. Yet Nimitz understood that the mood at the top of the command structure was leaching down through every layer of the organization. If Gormley believed the fight was unwinnable, that belief would travel through his staff and down to the captains of ships, the junior officers plotting courses through contested waters, and ultimately to the sailors and marines whose courage would determine whether Guadalcanal stood or fell. In early October, Nimitz made his choice. He would bring in William Halsey, recently recovered from his hospitalization, the admiral whose name in 1942 carried the weight of defiance and aggression, the officer who had led the early carrier raids and whose public profile was built on fighting back. Nimitz was not replacing Gormley because the older officer was incompetent. He was replacing him because the moment demanded not competence, but ferocity. The message reached Halsey while he was still in poor health, his skin condition far from fully healed, his energy reserves still depleted by months of hospitalization. He was at Pearl Harbor when the summons came. Nimitz did not ask him if he was ready. He simply told him, "The South Pacific is yours." Halsey was to take command of the entire area, the South Pacific area, and the South Pacific forces, and he would report directly to Nimitz. The scope of the command was enormous. It encompassed not just Guadalcanal, but the entire campaign, up through the Solomon Islands, hundreds of miles of ocean, a dozen different task forces scattered across multiple time zones, supply lines stretching back to Hawaii and California, and a ground war in the jungle that he would not directly control, but could not ignore. When Halsey accepted the assignment, he understood that he was stepping into a situation that had exhausted a careful, methodical officer. Now it would be his burden to carry. Halsey's first act was to board a ship and sail to Noumea, the capital of New Caledonia, and the headquarters of the South Pacific Command. As he approached the compound, he saw the evidence of months of fighting in the faces of officers who came to greet him. The weariness, the carefully maintained discipline barely concealing the deeper exhaustion beneath it, the sense that they were living through a war they were slowly losing. The staff officers presented him with situation reports and casualty figures and supply manifests. The information was accurate. The situation was dire. Japanese reinforcements were still coming. American pilots were tired. The Marines on Guadalcanal reported that supplies were at minimum levels. The Japanese held the high ground in the interior of the island and controlled the night. It was, on paper, a military situation that justified Gormley's increasingly cautious reports. It was the kind of tactical picture that invited retreat and consolidation, and a slow, grinding war of attrition measured in months and years. Halsey listened to the briefing, and then he did something that would become the defining act of his command in the South Pacific. He did not retreat into his quarters to study maps and intelligence reports. He did not call another meeting to discuss possibilities and probabilities. Instead, he walked to the operations center and made a series of instant decisions that were delivered with a velocity that left his staff breathless. He ordered ships to prepare for immediate sailing. He directed that every available combat aircraft be readied for strike operations. He called commanders of task forces and carrier groups directly and told them, in language that was direct and sometimes profane, that their orders had changed. They were no longer in a holding pattern. They were going to start pressing the Japanese, testing their strength, conducting offensive operations in strength and frequency that would reverse the psychological balance of the campaign. When officers cautiously suggested that this pace of operations might accelerate losses, Halsey responded with a statement that would ripple through the entire command. He told them that the only thing worse than losing ships was losing men's will to fight, and that he had seen enough of that. They were going on the offensive, and they were going to do it now. The effect of Halsey's arrival was nearly instantaneous. Within days, officers and sailors throughout the command began to notice the change. The atmosphere at headquarters shifted. The caution that had pervaded decision-making gave way to a kind of controlled urgency. Halsey walked through the compound and stopped junior officers in corridors to ask them about their work. He appeared on the docks when ships were being loaded with supplies and ammunition, watching the work himself, asking captains about their readiness and their crew's morale. He did something else that was perhaps more important than any order he issued. He made it clear, through words and actions, that he expected to share the risk that his men were taking. He was not a command figure who would operate from a rear area and send others into danger. He would be present at forward bases when operations were underway. He would sleep the same number of hours they did, work the same schedule, carry the same weight of decision and consequence. For men who had spent months under a commander who seemed to be managing decline, the arrival of Halsey was like a current switched on. Suddenly, the forward momentum that had stalled was moving again. Halsey's first strategic action was to push the campaign toward Bougainville and Rabaul, the massive Japanese air and naval base that was the true cornerstone of Japanese strength in the Solomon Islands. Rather than wait for the slow accumulation of resources, he began planning a series of amphibious landings that would leapfrog up the island chain, each one positioned to neutralize Japanese bases without requiring a frontal assault on the strongest positions. He understood, at a level that his planning staffs were only beginning to articulate, that the campaign would be won not by a single decisive engagement, but by a series of carefully choreographed operations that would gradually shift the balance of power in the South Pacific. Each landing would require naval cover. Each naval operation would require carrier support. Each carrier operation would impose losses, but those losses would be absorbed, replaced, and the momentum would continue northward. This was not the strategy of a cautious commander. It was the strategy of a man who understood that in war, the side that maintains momentum often wins, regardless of the balance of force at any given moment. Within his first 2 weeks, Halsey sent his available carriers and cruisers to conduct strikes against Japanese positions in the Central Solomons. The operations were not enormous in scale. The numbers of aircraft and ships involved were smaller than the major fleet operations that had characterized the campaign's earlier phases, but they were conducted with such frequency and such clear intent that the Japanese command began to realize they were facing a fundamentally different opponent. Halsey was not trying to achieve a knockout blow. He was trying to establish a rhythm of American pressure that would gradually wear down Japanese strength and convince the soldiers and sailors fighting in the islands that their command was committed to pushing the enemy back. Every carrier strike, every cruiser bombardment, every transport bringing fresh supplies, all of it sent the same message. The Americans were not leaving. They were moving forward, and the officer now commanding them was not going to stop until they had driven the Japanese out of the Solomon Islands entirely. The Marines on Guadalcanal noticed the change almost immediately. Supplies began arriving with greater regularity. Requests for air support that had gone unfulfilled under Gormley's command were now answered in a matter of hours instead of days. When Japanese attempts to reinforce the island continued, Halsey made sure that American naval forces were in position to meet them. The night battles that resulted were savage and often drew American blood, but there was a difference in how they were being fought now. Under Gormley, each engagement had felt like a desperate defense of ground that was slowly being lost. Under Halsey, each battle felt like a step forward, even when the tactical outcome was ambiguous or costly. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. The men who were fighting, whether they were sailors on destroyers in Iron Bottom Sound or Marines in the jungle, began to feel that they were no longer being managed in a slow retreat, but being pressed forward in a fight that their command believed could be won. Halsey's relentless forward pressure alarmed some of his staff officers and some of his subordinate commanders. They understood the logic of his aggression, but they worried about its cost. Navy ships were not unlimited resources. Each destroyer sent into combat could be sunk. Each carrier that launched strike after strike was wearing down its aircraft and its crews to exhaustion. Even Halsey's enormous physical stamina had limits, and he was burning through his administrative staff at a pace that left them hollow-eyed and shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep. Some of the senior captains and rear admirals under his command felt that he was pushing faster than prudence allowed, that he was accepting risks that, while perhaps ultimately justified, seemed reckless in the moment. But none of them removed themselves from the command. None of them asked for transfer or quietly filed objections with higher authority. Instead, they matched his pace. They drove their ships harder. They pushed their crews to launch more sorties, conduct more bombardments, maintain more patrols. The culture of the entire command transformed, not gradually through persuasion, but almost overnight, through the simple act of a commander arriving, who believed that aggression was not just a tactic, but a necessity. The month of October 1942 marked the true turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign, though it would take months more of grinding fighting before the Japanese finally conceded the island and withdrew their surviving forces. But the American soldiers and sailors and pilots who were fighting that battle in real time knew that something fundamental had shifted. The reinforcements they needed were arriving. The air support that had seemed so scarce was becoming more available. The Japanese were still fighting with the same determination and skill they had always shown. But the American command was no longer simply trying to hold on. It was pushing back. And that made all the difference between a campaign that might be lost and a campaign that could be won. Halsey, sick and recently hospitalized, carrying the scars of an aggressive career that had already cost him the command during Midway, had stepped into a moment when American strength was sufficient, but American will was wavering. By sheer force of personality and relentless forward pressure, he had reversed that equation. The men were still afraid, the casualty lists were still arriving, but they knew now that they were fighting under a commander who would spend their lives as carefully as he could, while ensuring that those lives were spent in a fight they could actually win. In the history of military command, few arrivals have transformed a campaign as quickly or as completely as Halsey's arrival at Noumea in October 1942. He had come to a command that was balanced on the edge of defeat. Within weeks, that command was pressing forward. The only variable that had changed was the man at the top. By the autumn of 1942, the waters surrounding Guadalcanal had become a furnace of naval violence, unlike anything the American Navy had encountered in its entire history. The campaign itself was already 3 months old, and the island had become a grinding nightmare of supply shortages, tropical disease, and Japanese air attacks that struck from the north almost every day at noon, with such predictable regularity that the Marines had named it the Tokyo Express. But it was what happened after dark that truly terrified the men serving in the waters around Henderson Field. The Japanese Navy, masters of night combat and equipped with superior torpedoes and fire control systems that could see in darkness far better than American equipment allowed, had transformed the narrow waters around the island into what sailors themselves would come to call Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard where steel ships went to die, and men learned what it meant to abandon their homes in the ocean. Halsey understood what was happening in those waters with absolute clarity. The Japanese were using the darkness to run down what they called the Rat Run, fast warships and fast transport vessels that would race down from Rabaul in the northern Solomon Islands after sunset, land supplies, and reinforcements on Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, and then race back north before dawn could expose them to American air attack from Henderson Field. Each night these runs strengthened the Japanese garrison on the island. Each successful Rat Run meant more Japanese soldiers to defend Guadalcanal, more ammunition in Japanese bunkers, more food in Japanese supply dumps, and therefore greater likelihood that the island would either be retaken or that American forces would be slowly bled white trying to hold it. The mathematics of the situation were remorseless. If the Japanese could sustain their presence on the island, while simultaneously whittling down American ships and men, they could either push the Americans into the sea or force Washington to abandon the campaign as too costly to continue. Halsey had inherited this desperate situation when he arrived in Noumea in October, and he had made it immediately clear that there was only one acceptable response to the Rat Run. They had to be stopped. Not delayed, not disrupted, but stopped completely. And to stop them, American ships would have to fight in the darkness against an enemy that owned the night. The first major test came on the 11th of October 1942, when Halsey made the decision to send Rear Admiral Norman Scott out with a small force of cruisers and destroyers. The cruisers Boise and Salt Lake City, the light cruisers Helena and San Juan, and 4 destroyers, to intercept a Japanese Rat Run heading south. Scott and his men set up their ambush north of Savo Island, lying in wait in waters where American ships had already suffered catastrophic losses. What happened next was a battle that vindicated everything Halsey had gambled on. Through a combination of superb radar work by the Helena and aggressive tactics by Scott, the American force caught the Japanese in a night engagement where, for once, American technology and training gave the advantage to the American ships. The Japanese cruiser Furitaka was sunk, along with one of their destroyers, and the entire Rat Run was scattered and repelled without a single American ship sunk in the action. It was a tactical victory that demonstrated something profound. If American commanders were willing to accept night combat and fight aggressively enough, they could win even against a Japanese navy that had always owned the darkness. The men of the American Navy took enormous pride in this victory, and Halsey took something else: confirmation that his strategy of relentless aggression was the only way forward. But triumph in war, even when earned through courage and skill, rarely comes without cost, and the cost was about to become very steep. 2 nights later, in the early morning darkness of the 13th of October, the Japanese launched a massive bombardment of Henderson Field itself, sending 2 battleships and associated cruisers and destroyers down from the north, specifically to destroy the airfield that gave the Americans their one irreplaceable advantage on Guadalcanal. The bombardment was devastating. The field was cratered and torn, the fuel dumps damaged, and the squadron strength of American aircraft at Henderson Field was significantly reduced by the time dawn came. The Japanese had answered Halsey's aggression with their own, and they had struck a serious blow. Halsey's response was instantaneous and characteristic. He ordered an immediate night surface battle to prevent the Japanese from consolidating their advantage and to strike back at the enemy fleet while it was still within reach. On the night of the 13th and 14th of October, he sent down another force, this time under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, one of the most technically proficient naval officers in the entire American fleet, and a man who had spent years studying gunnery and fire control. The battle that followed was one of the most complex and brutal surface engagements of the war. Lee had 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 8 destroyers. A substantial force, but still smaller than what he was facing. The Japanese were bringing down heavy cruisers and light cruisers and destroyers of their own, and what unfolded in the darkness north of Savo Island became a nightmare of confusion, near collisions, gunfire so intense that men could barely comprehend what was happening, and losses that would shock the entire American Navy when the final reckoning was made. The heavy cruiser Chester was damaged, her superstructure torn by Japanese shells and fires erupting across her decks. The destroyer Cushing was sunk by Japanese gunfire, going down in the dark water with a significant portion of her crew. The destroyer Laffey was so badly damaged that she would barely make it back to port, her entire superstructure shredded by enemy shells. The destroyer Barton was sunk with most of her crew, and the destroyer Monson was hit repeatedly and would be scuttled the following day after burning all night. But in the chaos and blood and confusion, the American force had inflicted equally brutal damage on the Japanese. Lee's gunfire and torpedo attacks had sunk or damaged multiple Japanese warships. The Japanese had not achieved the overwhelming victory they had sought, and the bombardment of Henderson Field, while damaging, had not knocked the airfield out of action completely. Halsey was paying an extraordinary price for his strategy of aggression. The American Navy was suffering losses that seemed unacceptable to many senior officers in the Navy Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Ships were being sunk at a rate that threatened to exhaust American naval strength in the Pacific, long before new construction could replace the losses. Men were dying in the waters around Guadalcanal at a rate that troubled the Navy's personnel officers, who knew that maintaining the morale of the fleet depended on not asking men to make suicide charges against superior forces night after night. But Halsey also understood something that his civilian superiors in Washington could not always appreciate from the comfort of their officers. If he did not send his ships into battle, the Rat Run would win. The Japanese would reinforce and resupply their garrison until they had the strength to retake Henderson Field. The American forces on Guadalcanal would eventually be overwhelmed, and the entire campaign would collapse in failure. It was not a theoretical concern. It was a very real possibility. The Japanese were moving significant forces toward Guadalcanal, and the window of opportunity to stop them was closing week by week. The attrition continued through the late autumn of 1942. The waters around Guadalcanal became a rotating horror of surface battles, air battles, and submarine attacks, with the Americans fighting a continuous campaign to maintain supply to their forces on the island, while simultaneously trying to prevent the Japanese from using the same waters to bring in their own reinforcements. The light cruiser Atlanta was sunk on the 15th of November in a night surface engagement, taking her commander and most of her officers down with her. The heavy cruiser San Francisco was so badly damaged in the same engagement that she barely remained afloat, her superstructure torn apart by enemy fire, her decks running with blood from the casualties. The destroyer Cushing, already damaged in an earlier engagement, was finally sunk after weeks of repair work at sea. The list went on, accumulating like a ledger of sacrifice, written in steel and blood, and the lives of men whose names would appear in casualty lists sent to wives and mothers and children across America. Each name on those lists represented a choice Halsey had made. Each sunk ship was a calculation he had performed. The cost now against the cost later, the certain loss against the possible gain, the blood of American sailors against the survival of the Guadalcanal campaign. What Halsey did not know, and what American intelligence only slowly began to understand through the winter of 1942 and into 1943 was that his calculations were correct in a way that the horrific costs could not fully reveal to observers at the time. The Japanese Navy was suffering losses it could not sustain. The surface ships being sunk in the waters around Guadalcanal were not being replaced. The experienced officers and sailors commanding those ships, men who had spent years in the Japanese Navy and understood their ships and their tactics and their capabilities in ways that could not be easily replaced, were dying in the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound. The replacement ships coming from Japanese shipyards were excellent vessels, but they were being commanded and crewed by officers and sailors with far less experience than the men they replaced. The replacement pilots coming to Japanese air units to replace the skilled aviators being lost in combat around Guadalcanal were trained to a far lower standard because the Japanese aviation training program had been decimated by months of attrition. The Japanese Navy was being slowly bled, and the rate of bleeding was increasing. The cumulative effect of months of sustained combat was invisible to the naked eye at the time. The Japanese Navy continued to send rat runs down the slot toward Guadalcanal through November and December. They continued to attack American ships with fierce determination and genuine tactical skill. But with each month that passed, the attacks became slightly less well coordinated, the torpedo runs slightly less accurate, the gunnery slightly less effective. The replacement crews were trying as hard as their predecessors, but they did not have the experience, and experience was what kept you alive in the darkness around Guadalcanal. It was what allowed you to judge the moment to turn into an enemy torpedo run. It was what taught you how to maintain your composure when the ship was being raked by enemy gunfire, and men were screaming around you, and fires were breaking out across the deck. The newer Japanese crews and officers had been trained to fight, but they had not been trained by the hardest teacher of all, survival in actual combat. As the year 1942 turned into 1943, this gap in experience became increasingly apparent to anyone with eyes to see it. By the end of November, it became clear that the rat run was failing. The Japanese could still bring supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal, but the effort was costing them more than they could sustain. The losses were mounting in a way that the Japanese Navy could not replace. Halsey's aggressive strategy, brutal as it was working. The waters around Guadalcanal had indeed become an Iron Bottom Sound, a place where ships went to be destroyed and men went to be killed. But that furnace of violence was slowly grinding the Japanese Navy into exhaustion. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal, instead of growing stronger with each rat run, was finding itself cut off and isolated, unable to receive the supplies and reinforcements it needed to retake the island from the Americans who controlled Henderson Field. By December, the Japanese military leadership had reached a grim conclusion. Guadalcanal could not be retaken. The resources required would be too great, the losses would be too severe, and the American Navy, whatever the cost to itself, was simply not going to be defeated through the slow attrition of surface warfare in the darkness. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal was not announced in Tokyo as a defeat. The official language spoke of a strategic withdrawal and a consolidation of defensive positions. But everyone who understood naval warfare knew what had actually happened. The Japanese Navy had lost the initiative in the Solomon Islands. Halsey's gamble to take enormous losses now in exchange for preventing even greater losses later, to accept the certain costs of night surface battles in order to deny the Japanese the opportunity to reinforce and eventually retake the island, had been vindicated by the mathematics of attrition. The American ships sunk around Guadalcanal were being replaced by American shipyards working at full capacity. The American sailors lost in combat were being replaced by American recruiting and training systems that were expanding exponentially. The American naval industry had the capacity to sustain losses that would have crippled any other nation. The Japanese did not. They had lost the war of replacement, and they had lost it in the waters around Guadalcanal, in the grinding months of 1942, when Halsey had forced them to choose between victory and survival, and they had, ultimately, been unable to achieve either. What remained after the Japanese evacuation was complete was a quiet that seemed unnatural to the men who had fought in those waters. The rat runs stopped coming. The night surface battles ceased. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The Guadalcanal campaign, which had threatened to become an endless drain of American resources and American lives, had instead become the pivotal campaign where the Japanese Navy began its long, irreversible decline. Halsey had paid for that victory in sunken ships and dead sailors, in the nightmares of men who had survived when so many others had not, in the knowledge that some of his decisions had been correct and some had been costly mistakes, and in the permanent scarring of his reputation that came from asking men to die in darkness against enemies they could barely see. But he had learned something in those months that would inform every decision he would make for the rest of the war. Aggression, when wielded ruthlessly and without sentiment, could force an enemy into impossible choices. The price might be terrible, but the price of passivity would have been far worse. In the spring of 1943, the war in the Pacific had settled into a pattern of grinding attrition that neither side could sustain indefinitely. The Americans had seized the initiative after Guadalcanal, but the Japanese Navy still possessed ships, still commanded respect, and still harbored the capacity to inflict terrible damage on the advancing American forces. At the highest levels of Japanese naval command, the man responsible for planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, the act that had brought the United States into the war, remained deeply influential in strategic thinking about how to recover lost ground and rebuild Japanese fortunes. His name was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and in April of 1943, he was about to make a journey that would change the entire course of the Pacific War. What neither Yamamoto nor his staff fully grasped was that the Americans possessed a tool far more powerful than any battleship or carrier task force. They could read the Japanese fleet's most secret radio communications. For months, American codebreakers working in basement offices and makeshift facilities across the Pacific had been systematically decrypting the Japanese naval code, a triumph of mathematics, patience, and intellectual labor that remained one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. Every intercept was a fragment of the enemy's mind, a glimpse into Japanese operational plans before they unfolded. In the early days of April, those codebreakers discovered something extraordinary. A message outlining Admiral Yamamoto's inspection itinerary through the Solomon Islands, complete with dates, times, aircraft types, and flight routes. Information so specific and so valuable that it posed an agonizing question for the American command structure. The decision that now presented itself to Halsey and his superiors transcended the normal calculus of military opportunity. Yamamoto was not merely an admiral. He was the architect of the strategy that had brought Japan into the war against America, the man who had conceived and executed the December attack on Pearl Harbor, and the officer most instrumental in every major Japanese naval operation since. Killing him would strike a blow against Japan's strategic coherence at precisely the moment when American forces were beginning to seize the initiative in the Central Pacific. But authorizing an ambush based on decoded intelligence carried a risk that made senior commanders genuinely hesitant. If the Japanese discovered that their naval code had been broken, they would change it immediately, and the Americans would lose the single most valuable intelligence advantage they possessed in the war. That intelligence advantage, the ability to read Japanese messages, was worth more in practical military terms than several carrier battle groups. It had already saved American lives by warning of Japanese movements. It would save countless more before the war ended. The stakes in the decision were almost unimaginably high, and they extended far beyond the life or death of a single man, however brilliant or however lethal. Halsey understood this. So did Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and so did the officers at the intelligence offices who knew exactly what decryption meant for future operations. The Japanese admiral's itinerary was meticulously precise, a reflection of both bureaucratic discipline and the confidence that came from believing Japanese air superiority remained unchallenged in the South Pacific. Yamamoto would depart from Rabaul in 2 transport aircraft, fast twin-engine bombers converted to carry high-ranking officers, escorted by 6 or more fighters. He would fly south toward the Solomon Islands, conducting inspection visits at several bases before returning. The flight path, the departure time, and the estimated arrival windows were all specified in the intercept. It was not routine travel. It was a combat zone inspection tour, the kind of movement that demanded absolute secrecy. Yet, the very precision that made the intelligence so valuable also made it actionable. American fighter pilots based on Guadalcanal, itself still being built up and consolidated as an American airfield, would have the range to intercept the flight if they were launched at the right moment. They could climb to the altitude Yamamoto's transport would be flying at, and they could position themselves to meet the Japanese aircraft at a carefully calculated point in space and time. The tactical problem was solvable, but only if the risk to the intelligence secret was accepted. Halsey's response, when the question reached his headquarters in Noumea, was direct and unambiguous. He recommended that the mission proceed. The reasoning was partly tactical. Yamamoto was an enemy commander of extraordinary skill and strategic importance. But it was also something more than that. Halsey had never been a man to refuse combat when the opportunity presented itself, and the chance to strike at the man most responsible for Pearl Harbor carried an almost poetic weight. There was a symmetry to it that appealed to him. The admiral whose force had attacked American carriers at Pearl Harbor would himself be attacked in the open sky. Halsey approved the operation, and the order began moving down the chain of command to the fighter pilots who would execute it. The Americans classified the operation under a deliberately vague designation, carefully avoiding any indication in written orders that the intelligence came from decoded Japanese communications. The story passed down to the pilots would be simpler. Long-range reconnaissance had spotted Yamamoto's aircraft, and they were being sent to intercept. That was the cover story, and it would hold, but the truth was that every fighter pilot climbing into the air above Guadalcanal on the 18th of April was flying because of mathematics done in hidden offices by men they would never meet. The morning of the flight was warm and humid, the typical weather of the South Pacific. 16 American fighters, P-38 Lightnings, twin fuselaged fighters with exceptional range and climbing ability, took off from Guadalcanal's Henderson Field, their pilots aware only that they were being sent to hunt a high-value Japanese target. The flight was long, nearly 400 miles from base, and the margin for error was extremely narrow. The pilots had to find the Japanese aircraft at precisely the right moment, at the intersection of 2 trajectories calculated across empty ocean and unforgiving distance. There was no margin for hesitation or for the mechanical failures that could scatter any mission across vast stretches of nothing. The lead American flight included 4 fighters designated as the main intercept force, with the others providing close support and protection. The pilots were skilled, combat-tested men, but no amount of skill guarantees success at this level of difficulty. As the minutes accumulated and the Guadalcanal airfield disappeared behind them, the only certainty was that they were committed now, that there was no turning back, regardless of what they found or failed to find. The Japanese admiral's aircraft departed Rabaul on schedule, escorted by fighters tasked with protecting him from any hostile encounter. Yamamoto himself was in the first transport, seated in the cabin of the aircraft, unaware that his movement had been intercepted or that danger was gathering somewhere in the distance above the Solomon Islands. From his perspective, this was a routine inspection tour in an area that the Japanese still controlled or heavily influenced. His concerns were operational, assessing the fighting capacity of his forward bases, visiting commanders in the field, understanding the current state of the fleet and its readiness for future operations. He did not know that the Americans could read his messages. Very few men in the Japanese military hierarchy actually knew that, and the compartmentalism of intelligence knowledge meant that even senior commanders operated within significant blindness about what the enemy might know about them. The flight proceeded south, the fighters maintaining their escort position, the engines of the transport droning steadily through the morning air. The American fighters found the Japanese aircraft. 17 minutes past 9 o'clock in the morning, the P-38 pilots spotted the formations they had been sent to find, and in that instant, the careful calculations and the hidden intelligence work crystallized into a moment of pure combat. The American fighters dove toward the Japanese flight, closing with the escort fighters while moving to intercept the transports themselves. The escort fighters fought back with the desperation of men trying to protect a commander they served. But the American pilots had surprise, superior positioning, and aircraft that were faster and more capable in a climbing turn. The dogfight that followed was brief and savage. One of the Japanese transports took cannon fire, was struck multiple times, and fell burning toward the jungle below. Yamamoto's aircraft had been hit. The great strategist of the Pacific War, the man who had conceived Pearl Harbor and orchestrated the Japanese Navy's most ambitious operations, was killed in that moment, struck down not by an enemy he could face across the water, but by a pilot whose name he had never known, flying a fighter his intelligence services had underestimated, operating on intelligence his codebreakers had failed to protect. The news of Yamamoto's death took time to filter through the Japanese military establishment. He was missing, then he was presumed lost. Then the Japanese Navy formally announced his death in a ceremony that acknowledged the loss of one of their greatest commanders. In Tokyo, the strategic implications began to settle over the naval staff. Yamamoto had been more than an admiral. He had been a symbol of Japanese naval power and the architect of their entire Pacific strategy. His loss was not immediately catastrophic in operational terms. The war continued. Other commanders stepped forward. Japanese ships still sailed and fought, but something had shifted. The unified strategic vision that Yamamoto had provided began to fragment. The aggressive operational planning that had characterized the early years of the war could not be easily continued without him, and the Japanese Navy gradually moved toward a more defensive, reactive posture. Whether this shift would have happened anyway is a question that historians have debated for nearly 80 years, but the timing was significant and the loss was real. For the American side, the operation had been a success, but it carried a price that only the highest levels of command fully understood. The codebreakers had been right, the intelligence had been perfect, and the intercept had worked as planned. But now there was a risk that the Japanese might wonder how the Americans had found Yamamoto with such precision. They had decoded the intercept as suggesting that long-range reconnaissance had spotted the Admiral's aircraft, but intelligent officers in Tokyo and Rabaul could calculate trajectories and flight times just as well as American officers could. The very precision of the ambush might begin to suggest that something more than routine reconnaissance was involved. For weeks, there was enormous tension among the American intelligence officers who knew the secret, the men who understood that the code-breaking advantage was the jewel of the entire Pacific War intelligence effort. If the Japanese changed their codes because of the Yamamoto operation, the consequences would ripple through every remaining year of the conflict. But the Japanese military, constrained by their own internal hierarchies, and perhaps handicapped by an inability to imagine that their codes might be compromised, ultimately did not change their principal naval code. The secret held, the risk had been taken and survived. Halsey accepted responsibility for the decision without equivocation. When questions arose later about whether the operation had been wise, whether the intelligence risk had been worth the tactical gain, he defended the choice as a commander's necessary decision in wartime. He had been offered the opportunity to strike at an enemy commander of exceptional importance, and he had taken it. That was what commanders did. That was what aggression meant in the context of modern war. The fact that the decision had been wise in its outcome, that the intelligence secret had held, that Yamamoto's death had contributed to a loss of strategic coherence in the Japanese Navy, seemed to vindicate the choice, though Halsey was not a man inclined to wait for vindication before committing to a course of action. He would have made the same decision if the outcome had been different, if the Japanese had changed their codes, if the cost had been higher. The decision reflected his entire philosophy of command. Take the fight to the enemy, seize the moment, act with maximum aggression, and accept the consequences. The death of Yamamoto did not change the fundamental trajectory of the Pacific War. The Japanese were already losing, already in a defensive posture that would only become more desperate as American industrial capacity and manpower advantages accumulated through 1943 and into 1944. But the loss of the admiral who had unified Japanese naval strategy meant that future Japanese operations would be less coherent, less brilliantly conceived, less capable of achieving surprise or executing complex multi-pronged campaigns. The Japanese Navy's subsequent major operations, Leyte Gulf, the defense of the Mariana Islands, the final kamikaze campaigns, would lack the unified strategic direction that Yamamoto had provided. They would be desperate, reactive, and ultimately futile. Whether this loss of strategic brilliance mattered in the context of a war Japan could not win is another historical question, but the absence of Yamamoto's genius was felt nonetheless. Halsey had not ended the war by ordering that ambush, but he had removed from the Japanese command structure the one officer who might have extracted additional months of coherent resistance from the forces still at his disposal. In the calculus of the Pacific War, that was no small thing. What remained after the spring of 1943 was the knowledge, held by a very small number of American officers, that they had made a decision that traded away a piece of strategic advantage, the secret of code breaking, in exchange for the death of an exceptional enemy commander. The mathematics of the trade were impossible to calculate precisely, because the counterfactual, what would have happened if Yamamoto had lived, exists only in speculation and debate. But what was certain was that the operation had worked, that the American pilots had done their duty, that the enemy commander had been killed, and that the secret, against the odds, had held. Halsey had been presented with a choice between restraint and action, and he had chosen action. That choice, repeated across hundreds of decisions over the course of the war, would define his legacy and his reputation. For now, in the spring of 1943, there was only the quiet satisfaction of having struck at the enemy when the enemy had been vulnerable, and the knowledge that the war, slowly and at enormous cost, was beginning to turn in America's favor. The victory at Guadalcanal left Halsey with a problem that was almost as demanding as the campaign he had just won. The Japanese still held a chain of heavily fortified islands, stretching up through the Solomon Archipelago, culminating in the monster base at Rabaul on New Britain, a fortress that contained airfields, naval installations, barracks, and enough defensive firepower to consume any fleet reckless enough to assault it directly. Halsey possessed the resources and the momentum to drive forward, but he did not possess the luxury of time or the appetite for another grinding campaign like Guadalcanal, where every yard of jungle had to be paid for in blood. The answer lay in a concept that would come to define the remainder of the Pacific War: the island-hopping strategy, a method of advance that would bypass the strongest enemy positions and strangle them into irrelevance. It was not a strategy born from any single brilliant mind, but rather a pragmatic evolution that emerged from the constraints of limited shipping, limited manpower, and the need to maintain forward momentum. Halsey understood this instinctively. He did not need to be convinced that the direct approach to Rabaul was a trap. What he needed was a way to advance, to maintain the offensive pressure that kept the Japanese off balance, and to do so without incurring the catastrophic casualties that would horrify the American public and drain resources needed across the entire Pacific. The campaign through the Central Solomons that began in the spring of 1943 followed a pattern that would become familiar as Halsey's forces pushed northward. The Japanese held New Georgia, Kolombangara, Choiseul, and a constellation of smaller islands, each garrisoned with troops, each reinforced by air bases, and each defended with the tenacity that Japanese soldiers had demonstrated throughout the war. Rather than assault each island head-on with a full-scale landing followed by weeks of jungle combat, Halsey and his subordinates developed a method of surgical strikes: land on the less heavily defended portions of the islands, where American forces could establish a beachhead, use carrier-based aviation and tactical air support to neutralize Japanese counterattacks, bring in coastal artillery and additional troops as the situation permitted, and gradually expand the perimeter until the enemy position became untenable. The strategy economized on American casualties by shifting the burden from the infantry to naval gunfire and air power. It reduced the time any single engagement would require, lowering the drain on shipping and keeping the momentum of advance constant. Most critically, it did not require the destruction of every Japanese soldier on every island. It required only that American forces seize enough ground to establish air bases, which could then be turned on the next Japanese position further up the chain. It was an approach born from the brutal mathematics of amphibious warfare in the Pacific, and it would shape the American advance all the way to Japan. The implementation of this strategy rested on Halsey's shoulders as commander, but the success of it depended on a generation of subordinates who had learned their craft in the grinding battles around Guadalcanal. Men like Major General John Vandergrift and Brigadier General Alexander Vandergrift had cut their teeth in the New Hebrides and the jungles of the canal, learning how to coordinate amphibious landings with air support, how to maintain supply lines under fire, and how to adapt plans when the Japanese responded with their own counteroffensives. Below them were the battalion commanders, the naval captains, the fighter pilots, and the junior officers who had seen enough combat to understand the difference between tactical boldness and reckless waste of lives. Halsey's approach to command gave these men room to think and to adapt. He set the overall strategic objective and provided the resources, but he did not micromanage the tactical details. When subordinates proposed alternative approaches to a problem, He listened, and when those approaches showed promise, he backed them. This style of command had a curious effect. It produced commanders who felt they had agency in the campaigns they fought, rather than mere executors of a distant superior's will. The morale benefits of this approach were real and substantial. Men fought harder and thought more clearly when they believed their intelligence and initiative mattered. Halsey's willingness to push his commanders hard, while granting them genuine autonomy, created an environment in which courage and competence could flourish. The New Georgia campaign in the early summer of 1943 illustrated this principle in action. The island was defended by approximately 10,000 Japanese troops, concentrated in fortified positions around the administrative center at Munda. Rather than land directly on Munda, American forces came ashore on the northern and western portions of the island, creating a beachhead away from the heaviest concentrations of Japanese defensive fire. Once ashore, the American forces, primarily composed of the 37th Infantry Division, pushed inland toward Munda in a grinding advance through jungle terrain, supported by carrier-based dive bombers and torpedo bombers that attacked Japanese supply lines and reinforcing positions. The campaign lasted through most of July and into early August, a process of steady pressure rather than dramatic breakthrough. The Japanese committed their own air and naval resources to disrupt the American landings and reinforce their garrison, leading to a series of night engagements around the island, where American and Japanese surface forces clashed in conditions of chaos and confusion. These fights, the Battle of the Gulf of Kula, the Battle of Kolombangara, were far less celebrated than the Great Fleet engagements, but no less vicious. American destroyers and light cruisers faced Japanese warships in pitch darkness, guided only by radar and the muzzle flashes of enemy guns, fighting engagements that lasted minutes, but determined the flow of reinforcements and supplies to the ground campaign. Through it all, Halsey maintained pressure on his commanders, pushed for aggressive advance, and refused to permit the campaign to settle into the static warfare that had characterized Guadalcanal. The result was that New Georgia fell in early August, and the Japanese evacuation of the island, a withdrawal Halsey permitted, rather than a destruction his forces inflicted, meant that American forces could move on to the next objective almost immediately. The capture of New Georgia was not a clean victory in the traditional sense. The Japanese managed to evacuate most of their combat-effective troops to other islands, leaving behind only holding forces. But from Halsey's perspective, this was precisely the point. He had not fought for the island for its own sake. He had fought for the airfield and the position it gave the American advance. Munda Airfield, once captured and repaired, became a base for American fighters and bombers that could range out over the next Japanese positions up the chain. It became a jumping-off point for further campaigns. It tied down Japanese resources and drew Japanese air strength down from Rabaul, where it was needed to defend against American strategic bombing. The island served its purpose and could be held with a minimum garrison while the main body of American forces pressed forward. This was the logic that governed Halsey's thinking through 1943. Every island was evaluated not for its intrinsic value, but for its contribution to the next step in the campaign. Every battle was assessed not by whether the enemy was annihilated, but by whether American forces could establish themselves firmly enough to advance again. Kolombangara presented a different problem and revealed the flexibility of Halsey's approach. The island was large, well defended, and the site of one of the Japanese Navy's most important bases in the Solomons. A frontal assault would have been brutally costly. Instead, American planners recommended a move around the island entirely, landing on nearby Vella La Vella to the north, using it as a base to establish airfields and continue the advance, and essentially isolating Kolombangara by cutting off its supply lines and air support. Halsey approved the strategy, and the Vella La Vella landing in August of 1943 went in virtually unopposed. The Japanese had committed their main forces to the defense of Kolombangara, and thus were not present to contest the American landing on Vella La Vella. The psychological impact on the Japanese command structure was immediate and severe. They had been outmaneuvered at the operational level, left holding an empty fortress, while the American advance simply moved past them. The lesson was plain. Holding ground was useless if the enemy could advance around you. This realization forced the Japanese to spread their already stretched forces even thinner across the archipelago, reducing the strength of every position in an effort to defend against landings that might come anywhere. The accumulation of these small victories, New Georgia, Vella La Vella, and the gradual consolidation of American air superiority over the Central Solomons, created an environment in which Halsey could launch the final push toward Bougainville in the autumn of 1943. Bougainville was the largest of the Solomon Islands, heavily defended, and positioned as the gateway to Rabaul. It was also home to several Japanese airfields, and served as the primary supply point for Japanese garrisons throughout the Lower Solomons. The American plan called for a massive amphibious landing near Cape Torokina on Bougainville's western coast, a position that would allow American forces to establish an airfield from which fighters could cover the landings and from which bombers could strike targets all the way to Rabaul. The landing was scheduled for the 1st of November, 1943, and the logistical requirements were staggering. Dozens of transport ships, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, would carry the initial assault wave, the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps under General Alexander Vandergrift, across the waters of the South Pacific, in conditions where Japanese air attack was a constant threat and Japanese naval intervention was possible. The assault would be supported by carrier-based aviation from Halsey's task forces and by the growing American air presence at the New Georgia and Vella La Vella airfields. Everything had to work in precise coordination. The operation began in the last week of October with preliminary bombardments and air strikes designed to soften the Japanese defensive positions and disrupt the Japanese response. On the 31st of October, American planes struck Japanese airfields and naval installations around Bougainville and Rabaul, attempting to establish local air superiority before the landings commenced. The Japanese responded with their own air attacks on American shipping, and for several days the two sides engaged in a furious air campaign over the waters around Bougainville. American pilots, now vastly more experienced than they had been at the beginning of the war, handled the Japanese pilots with increasing confidence and tactical superiority. The cumulative effect of months of combat, combined with American tactics that emphasized altitude advantage, superior damage control, and the ruthless destruction of Japanese experienced pilots who could not be easily replaced, had shifted the balance of air combat decisively in America's favor. When the transports approached the landing beach on the morning of the 1st of November, American air superiority was sufficiently established that Japanese aircraft had difficulty attacking the vulnerable ships. The landings themselves went in with relatively light resistance at the actual beach, though the campaign that followed would prove far more costly as Japanese forces in the interior of the island mobilized to counterattack the American beachhead. What made Bougainville critically important in the broader strategic picture was its location relative to Rabaul. Once American forces had established an airfield near Cape Torokina and begun flying combat missions from that base, Rabaul itself was brought within striking distance of American fighters and bombers. This transformed Rabaul from an advanced offensive base into a target that would require constant defense. Japanese air power that had been deployed for offensive operations against American shipping and invasion beaches now had to be committed to the defense of Rabaul and the airfields supporting it. The cumulative effect across the entire campaign, New Georgia, Vella Lavella, Bougainville, was that Halsey had gradually reduced the effectiveness of Japanese air and naval power, not through any single dramatic engagement, but through a process of methodical advance that choked off supply lines, forced Japanese forces to spread ever more thinly, and eventually rendered Rabaul strategically sterile. The Japanese could pour reinforcements into Rabaul, but those reinforcements would have to be flown in or shipped in, exposing them to American air attack at every stage. The garrison that held Rabaul would be ever more isolated, ever more dependent on supply that might not arrive, ever more forced into a purely defensive posture. The campaign through the Solomons also served another purpose that might have escaped the attention of commanders focused purely on tactical and operational questions. It was generating experience in amphibious warfare on a scale and with a complexity that the American military had not possessed before the war. The lessons learned in the Central and Northern Solomons: how to coordinate air support with ground forces, how to maintain supply lines under enemy fire, how to rotate units through combat while maintaining momentum, how to adapt plans when Japanese counterattacks arrived. These lessons would be encoded into doctrine and practice, and carried forward by the officers who had learned them through blood and circumstance. When larger amphibious operations were mounted later in the war, when hundreds of thousands of troops were transported across vast distances to assault major objectives, the commanders directing those operations would understand the principles because they had learned them in the smaller scale but no less demanding operations of 1943. Halsey had not set out to create a school for amphibious commanders, but that had been an effect of his strategy and command style. By the time the Bougainville campaign reached its final phases in the early winter of 1943, Rabaul was effectively isolated. Japanese air power, while still formidable, was insufficient to defend the base against the combined weight of American fighters, bombers, and naval aircraft striking from fields and carriers all around it. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul numbered almost 100,000 men, but they were no longer capable of projecting power. The bases in the Central Solomons that had supported them were in American hands. The supply lines bringing reinforcement and equipment were under constant American air attack. The waters around Rabaul were no longer secure for Japanese surface ships, which increasingly had to remain in port or operate at night under conditions of extreme vulnerability. Halsey had achieved through methodical advance and careful coordination what a direct assault on Rabaul would never have accomplished. He had rendered the fortress powerless without having to assault it. The Japanese would hold Rabaul until the war's end, a garrison that surrendered only after atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan accepted the inevitable. But from the perspective of the Pacific War's strategic trajectory, Rabaul had been beaten not on the day of its surrender, but through the campaigns of 1943 that cut it off from meaningful participation in the larger conflict. The significance of the Central Solomons and Bougainville campaigns extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Halsey had demonstrated that aggressive advance did not require reckless casualty rates. He had proven that careful coordination of counters. By the spring of 1943, William Halsey had already become something more than an admiral. He was a symbol. In the newspapers and magazines that reached American homes, his face appeared with increasing frequency. A lean, determined visage, often captured mid-gesture, jaw set, eyes fixed on some distant horizon only he could see. The public had a hunger for heroes in those middle years of the war, a hunger that grew sharper as the initial shock of Pearl Harbor faded into memory, and the long grinding work of island-hopping campaigns began to exhaust the national appetite for abstract strategic victories. Halsey filled that hunger like no other commander in the Pacific, where Admiral Chester Nimitz embodied measured competence and careful planning, and where General Douglas MacArthur projected a kind of theatrical grandeur. Halsey seemed to embody the visceral American impulse to fight back, to meet aggression with aggression, to transform the burning shame of December 1941 into righteous fury. The newspapers had seized on his reported comments to war correspondents, the famous quote about wanting to kill Japanese, wanting to see them die by the millions, words that were simultaneously celebrated by the public and quietly regretted by those who understood how such statements could be weaponized by enemy propagandists. Yet the regret never stopped the stories. The legend grew. By 1944, that legend had earned him something concrete. In June of that year, Halsey was promoted to full admiral, a rank that placed him among the Navy's most senior commanders. But more significantly, in August, he was given command of the Third Fleet, one of the most formidable aggregations of naval power ever assembled by any nation. The Third Fleet was not a replacement for the existing Pacific forces under Nimitz. It was, in essence, a rotation mechanism. The same ships and sailors that composed the Fifth Fleet under Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance would transform into the Third Fleet under Halsey's command when operational control passed from one commander to the other. It was a system designed to keep the fleet at sea continuously while allowing commanders periods of rest and reorganization. What mattered was that Halsey would now command not merely a task force or even a task group, but an entire fleet. Dozens of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, firepower that could reach out across the ocean and strike targets hundreds of kilometers away. The Third Fleet was anchored by fast fleet carriers, the Essex-class vessels that represented the peak of American carrier technology, and the Iowa-class battleships, ships of such power and sophistication that they rendered previous battleship designs instantly obsolete. Around these capital ships circled layers of cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, along with logistics ships designed to keep the fleet supplied and operational, without the necessity of returning to port for extended periods. When Halsey took command of this machinery, he took command of perhaps the most powerful naval force in the history of human warfare. The public celebrations that accompanied his promotion were immediate and voluminous. Life magazine and Time magazine published extended profiles. Radio broadcasts announced the news with fanfare. Military newsreels showed footage of Halsey on the bridge of his new flagship, the battleship Missouri, surveying the enormous fleet arrayed before him. Mayors and civic leaders sent congratulatory messages. A generation of young Americans who had followed his campaigns in the South Pacific now saw him elevated to a position from which he could, in theory, determine the course of the entire naval war. The assumption underlying all this celebration was that Halsey represented the future of American naval command, that the Navy's highest levels had recognized that aggressive, dynamic leadership was what the war demanded, and that his proven track record in the South Pacific had earned him the greatest responsibility the Navy could bestow. There was something almost mythological in the way the media portrayed the promotion. Halsey was not merely being given a command, he was being entrusted with the weapons that would bring Japan to its knees. The symbolism was not lost on anyone involved, least of all on Halsey himself. What was less visible in the fanfare, however, was a fundamental tension that the promotion had created. Halsey's reputation in the South Pacific had been built on a specific set of circumstances, a command area that was genuinely desperate, where the absence of resources and the magnitude of the threat had created conditions in which aggressive risk-taking could appear not merely justified, but essential. His willingness to sacrifice ships and men, his refusal to accept the conventional wisdom about impossible odds, his capacity to inspire fighting spirit in demoralized troops. These qualities had flourished in the context of near desperation. But the Third Fleet was not a desperate command. It was the most powerful instrument in the Navy's arsenal. The nature of what aggression could mean in such a context was fundamentally different. The public image of Halsey had been constructed around the idea that he was a man who would dare what others would not, who would take chances when conventional commanders would retreat into caution. But what happened when taking chances meant not the recovery of a failing island campaign, but the potential loss of the most powerful fleet in the world? What happened when the aggressive instincts that had served him so well in conditions of scarcity encountered conditions of almost unlimited power? These questions were not being asked in the summer of 1944, at least not in any public forum. The assumption among Halsey's superiors was that his record spoke for itself, that the same temperament that had reversed the situation in the South Pacific would now be channeled into delivering the crushing blow to Japan that would end the war. Admiral Nimitz, who retained overall command of all Pacific naval forces, had confidence in Halsey, though Nimitz's confidence in any subordinate was always measured and carefully qualified. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal and his civilian superiors in Washington saw in Halsey's promotion a vindication of their strategic vision, that the Navy could carry the war to Japan across the vast distances of the Pacific, that the age of the battleship had indeed given way to the age of the carrier, and that the right commander could exploit this transformation decisively. The political dimensions of Halsey's promotion were significant as well. He had become the most recognizable military figure in the Pacific theater, arguably in the entire war. Removing him from prominence would have been politically costly in an election year. Promoting him was the path of least resistance, and it carried the additional advantage of appearing to reward aggressive excellence. But Halsey himself understood, at some level that he may not have fully articulated even to himself, that the landscape of his command had changed fundamentally. The Third Fleet was his, at a moment when the war in the Pacific was entering a new phase. The great island-hopping campaigns that had consumed 1943 were giving way to operations of far greater complexity and scope. The Philippines were about to be invaded. The home islands of Japan itself were moving from theoretical future target to imminent objective. The war was no longer a matter of recovering lost ground or preventing Japanese expansion. It was a matter of bringing about the complete defeat and unconditional surrender of the enemy. These were vastly different propositions, and they demanded command styles that were not necessarily congruent with what had worked in the South Pacific. Halsey brought to the Third Fleet the same restless energy, the same fundamental belief in the superiority of offensive action, the same personal magnetism that had made him a legend among younger officers and enlisted men. But he would bring something else as well, something less visible, but ultimately more consequential. A growing gap between the reality of his position and the image of himself that he had begun to internalize. He was no longer an admiral fighting against overwhelming odds. He was the commander of overwhelming force. The difference was not merely a matter of degree, it was a matter of kind. The flagship Missouri represented this transformation in almost literal terms. The battleship, completed just months before Halsey took command, was the most powerful surface combatant in the world. With her 9 16-inch guns, she could hurl projectiles of more than a ton weight at targets beyond the horizon, striking with a force that could flatten entire city blocks. She embodied all the technological sophistication and industrial might that separated American naval power in 1944 from Japanese naval power in the same year. When Halsey stood on her bridge, he stood at the apex of American military power in the Pacific. The symbolism was almost overwhelming, yet the Missouri, for all her power, was now ultimately subordinate to the same strategic purposes that battleships had always served in a carrier-dominant navy. She was a capital ship, yes, but she was capital in an age when capital meant something fundamentally different than it had meant before. She could not win a battle by herself. She could not even engage the enemy without air superiority. Her power was enormous, but also conditional, dependent on circumstances and support systems that existed beyond her own steel hull. Halsey's command of the Third Fleet began in early 1944, but the full weight of his new responsibility would not become apparent until the autumn of that year, when the fleet would be committed to the greatest naval campaign in human history. In the summer months before that moment, he had time to familiarize himself with the fleet's command structure, to meet with his subordinates, to absorb the incredible complexity of maintaining and operating a naval force of such magnitude. He conducted exercises and training operations designed to refine the coordination between the carrier task groups and the battleship divisions, between the air operations and the surface gunnery, between the logistics apparatus and the combat forces. These months were a kind of honeymoon period, when the public celebration of his promotion was still fresh, when the legendary reputation he had built in the South Pacific seemed entirely vindicated by the magnitude of the command he now held. There was as yet no hint of the controversies that would dog his command of the Third Fleet, no sense that the same aggressive instincts that had made him invaluable in the darkest days of the Pacific War might become liabilities when deployed with the weapons of 1944 against an enemy that was still dangerous but increasingly desperate. What was beginning to happen, however, was a subtle shift in how Halsey understood himself and his role. He had always been a man of certainty, a commander who seemed to operate from bedrock convictions about what the Navy should do and how it should do it. But certainty can curdle into inflexibility. A willingness to take risks can become a compulsion toward risk-taking. The men who had served under him in the South Pacific spoke of his energy, his decisiveness, his refusal to accept defeat. Those same qualities, in a different context, could manifest as impulsiveness, as a resistance to advice that contradicted his own instincts, as an inability to acknowledge that the nature of naval command at the level of fleet admiral might demand something different than what had worked at the level of task force commander. The gap that would eventually become visible between the public Halsey, the aggressive, relentless fighter, and the private reality of his command decisions was beginning to widen in these months, quietly and almost imperceptibly, with few people aware that any widening was occurring at all. By the autumn of 1944, Halsey's Third Fleet was poised to enter the operations that would define both his legacy and the remaining year of the Pacific War. He carried with him the reputation of a man who had never accepted the idea that Japan could not be beaten decisively. He carried the confidence that comes from success, from having been right when others doubted, from having transformed desperate situations into victories. He carried also, though he was less aware of it, the seeds of the controversies that would follow. The weight of expectation had become almost palpable. The American public expected dramatic results from its most famous admiral. The Navy's senior leadership expected him to deliver victories that would validate their strategic vision. The men under his command expected to be led with the same aggressive determination he had demonstrated in the South Pacific. What none of them knew, what Halsey himself did not yet fully comprehend, was that the Third Fleet represented not a continuity with his earlier commands, but a fundamental shift in what command itself meant. and that the aggressive instincts that had made him legendary would soon be tested in ways that would reveal both their power and their limitations. The legend that had been carefully constructed over the previous 2 years was about to confront the full complexity of commanding the most powerful fleet ever assembled. That collision was less than 2 months away. The return to the Philippines was not a decision made in a vacuum. For more than 2 years, General Douglas MacArthur had promised the people of those islands that he would return, and by the autumn of 1944, the hour of that promise had arrived. The liberation was more than a military campaign. It was a moment of American resolve made flesh, a statement that territory surrendered in the darkness of 1942 would be reclaimed in the growing light of 1944. The operation would require an amphibious assault of unprecedented scale, thousands of ships carrying hundreds of thousands of troops, all of them moving through waters the Japanese Navy had dominated since the beginning of the war. The Philippines sat at the heart of Japanese conquest in Southeast Asia, and the Americans knew that the enemy would defend them with every remaining ship, every aircraft, every ton of fighting steel that Imperial Japan could still bring to bear. Halsey's Third Fleet, the fast carriers, the Iowa-class battleships, the screening destroyers and cruisers, would have the role of guardian and hunter. While the invasion fleet approached Leyte Gulf on the 24th of October 1944, Halsey's task was to crush any Japanese naval force that moved to interfere with the landings. He would strike first, strike hard, and establish absolute supremacy in the waters around the Philippines. The Navy had spent 2 years rebuilding after the disasters of the early war, 2 years constructing carriers and training pilots and learning how to wage fleet battle in an age when battleships had become secondary weapons. Halsey had fought through each phase of that resurrection, and now he commanded the result, the mightiest assemblage of naval power that any human had ever held in his hands. The 38 ships under his direct command included 5 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, bristling with aircraft, supported by 7 battleships, including the new fast battleships Iowa and New Jersey, armored fortresses that could travel at more than 30 knots. It was a weapon designed to deliver overwhelming force, and Halsey was precisely the kind of commander who would not hesitate to use every ounce of that power. But Halsey was not commanding in isolation. The arrangement of forces at Leyte Gulf embodied a compromise that would have calamitous consequences. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded the 7th Fleet, a separate force of older battleships, escort carriers, and transport vessels that would provide close support to the invasion troops and protect the central and southern approaches to Leyte Gulf. The command boundary between Halsey's 3rd Fleet and Kinkaid's 7th Fleet was clear on a map, but it was fundamentally ambiguous in practice. Neither commander had authority over the other. Neither could guarantee what the other would do. The strategic concept assumed that Halsey's offensive power would be sufficient to defeat any Japanese attempt to reach the invasion fleet, and that assumption was not unreasonable given the scale of American naval power. But assumptions were not the same as certainty, and the Japanese were about to demonstrate exactly what happened when command ambiguity met a desperate enemy. The Japanese High Command had understood for weeks what was coming. They knew that the Philippines were the logical next objective, and they knew that American dominance meant they could not stop an invasion through conventional defense. Their only path to victory was to achieve a massive naval concentration and strike a decisive blow before the Americans could consolidate their landing. Operation Show, the Japanese counteroffensive, was a complex gamble built on a principle of coordinated assault from multiple directions. 4 separate forces would converge on Leyte Gulf, 2 battleship squadrons approaching from the west through the Sibuyan Sea and the San Bernardino Strait, a 3rd force curving around through the Mindanao Strait in the south, and the last remnant of Japanese carrier strength approaching from the north. The carriers were nearly empty, stripped of most of their trained pilots, and functioning primarily as bait, a sacrifice designed to lure Halsey away from the central battle, while the battleships and cruisers did the actual killing. It was a plan that required perfect timing, perfect communication, and a degree of luck that even the Japanese knew they barely possessed. But it was the only plan they had, and the alternative was to watch the Americans tighten the noose without resistance. On the morning of the 24th of October, Halsey's reconnaissance aircraft began reporting targets. Japanese ships were approaching from multiple directions. In the Sibuyan Sea, American pilots found what they believed was the main Japanese striking force: battleships, cruisers, support vessels, all moving eastward towards San Bernardino Strait. Wave after wave of American carrier aircraft descended on these ships in attack runs that lasted through the entire day. The battleship Musashi, one of only 2 Yamato-class behemoths the Japanese Navy had ever built, was struck by repeated torpedo and bomb attacks. Slowly, inexorably, the great ship sank beneath the waves, after enduring more than a dozen torpedo hits and countless bomb strikes, a death that consumed more than 1,000 Japanese sailors and represented the loss of irreplaceable tonnage that Japan could never replace. Other ships were damaged, driven backward, forced to withdraw or sink. By the time the American air attacks ceased at late afternoon, Halsey was convinced that he had defeated the main Japanese threat. The enemy force in the Sibuyan Sea had turned around, he believed, and was retreating. The immediate danger had passed. What Halsey did not know was that the Japanese commander in the Sibuyan Sea had made the decision to turn around only temporarily. He would circle back. He would make another attempt to transit San Bernardino Strait during the darkness. The stroke that Halsey thought he had parried was merely delayed, not defeated, and at the same moment that American aircraft were mauling the Japanese battleships in the Sibuyan Sea, other reconnaissance reports were coming in from the north. Japanese carriers were approaching. This was the bait, though Halsey did not yet fully understand it. A handful of carriers with almost no aircraft on their decks, commanded by an admiral who knew with absolute certainty that he was leading them to their deaths. They were coming from the north, and they represented what Halsey saw as the primary threat, the force that could still strike American carriers and change the balance of the entire battle. The night of the 24th and the morning of the 25th were moments of confusion and gradual crystallization. American forces began moving into their assigned positions. Reports filtered in about enemy movements, some clear, some contradictory, some missing critical details that would only become apparent in the awful clarity of hindsight. The situation developed in real time, with fragmentary information flowing to commanders who had to make decisions on incomplete knowledge. Kinkaid's 7th Fleet continued to provide close support to the landing areas. Halsey's 3rd Fleet positioned itself to intercept what it believed was the main Japanese striking force. The Japanese center force, moving through San Bernardino Strait in the darkness, moved on through almost without detection. The forces were being arranged on the board in the pattern the Japanese had designed, and almost no one on the American side yet understood the true geometry of the trap. The opening actions of what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf saw American forces achieve tactical successes that seemed to confirm Halsey's assessment of the situation. Japanese ships were sunk and crippled. Damage was inflicted. The losses were absorbed with the satisfaction that comes from successful defense. But beneath the surface of these victories, something more dangerous was developing. The Japanese center force was approaching the unguarded San Bernardino Strait. The escort carriers and destroyers of Task Unit 77.4.2, the the small group that history would remember as Taffy 3, had no idea that they were about to become the focus of the largest Japanese surface fleet still operational. They were positioned to provide close air support to the invasion troops, never imagining that they would face battleships and cruisers in direct combat. The destroyers were not designed for fleet battle. The escort carriers were too lightly armored and too slow to escape. They were support vessels, not weapons of war, and they were about to find themselves in the most desperate situation any American naval force had faced since Pearl Harbor. Halsey remained focused on the Japanese carriers to the north. The reports kept coming in. Reconnaissance aircraft had located them, approaching closer and closer. Here was the enemy that Halsey understood. Carrier forces that could damage or sink his own carriers, that posed an existential threat to American naval power. The battleships and cruisers of the Japanese center force, meanwhile, slipped through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. No one was there to stop them. No one was there to report their passage with certainty. By the morning of the 25th of October, they would emerge from the strait into the Philippine Sea, where they would encounter the completely unprepared escort carriers of Taffy 3. The men aboard those small ships had no idea what was coming. They had no way to know that the command structure of the American Navy, with all its power and all its resources, had created a gap in coverage, precisely where the enemy had chosen to strike. The night of the 24th passed into the grey dawn of the 25th. The vast machinery of naval warfare continued to turn, each component moving according to its understood role, each commander responding to the information available to him. Halsey prepared to engage the Japanese carriers. Kinkaid's 7th Fleet was focused on the invasion, and in the darkness between them, the Japanese center force moved toward the greatest naval engagement of the war, a battle that would be decided not by battleships, but by the courage of men aboard escort carriers and destroyers, men who would be called upon to do the impossible, because the command structure that should have protected them had created a vacuum they would be forced to fill. The trap had been perfectly constructed. The bait was in place, and in a matter of hours, when the sun rose over the Philippine Sea on the morning of the 25th of October, 1944, the largest naval battle in history would begin, with an outcome that hung on a series of decisions made in the previous 24 hours. Decisions whose full consequences none of the men making them could yet perceive. The 25th of October 1944 begins in darkness and confusion. Around the Philippine island of Leyte, the greatest naval engagement in human history is already underway, but its outcome remains unknowable. Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet commands the most formidable striking force the United States Navy has ever assembled. Fast carriers, loaded with hundreds of aircraft, battleships of the Iowa class that can hurl 18-inch shells across the horizon, and supporting cruisers and destroyers distributed across hundreds of square kilometers of open ocean. The Japanese have committed what remains of their fleet to a last desperate gamble, but their plan depends entirely on one thing: separating the American forces, confusing their commanders, and striking at the vulnerable heart of the invasion fleet undefended. For months, Halsey has been the embodiment of American naval aggression, the admiral whose name is spoken with reverence by sailors who desperately want to strike back at Japan. His reputation burns bright, his confidence is absolute, and in this moment, both will be tested in ways that will reverberate through the rest of the war and beyond. The Japanese strategy, born from careful planning and born also from desperation, is a masterpiece of misdirection. They are sending multiple forces toward Leyte Gulf from different directions, hoping to confuse the Americans about which threat is primary and which is secondary. The center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, carries the largest concentration of firepower, battleships including the Yamato, the most powerfully armed warship ever built, along with heavy cruisers and destroyers. But when Kurita's force emerges from the San Bernardino Strait on the night of the 24th, it takes a battering from American submarines and aircraft. 2 heavy cruisers go down, others are damaged. Kurita turns around. He reports to his superiors that his force is withdrawing, that the operation cannot succeed. For a brief moment, it appears that the threat has passed. But then, inexplicably, Kurita changes his mind. He reverses course once more and heads back toward the San Bernardino Strait, pushing his wounded fleet southward into the darkness, preparing to pass through that narrow passage and emerge on the other side to devastate the American invasion fleet at Leyte. The decision is made in confusion, transmitted in unclear orders, and Halsey will never fully understand it. He does not even know it is happening. Meanwhile, to the north, American reconnaissance aircraft report the approach of a Japanese force. Carriers, fast warships, a striking force bearing down from the direction of the Philippines toward the American fleet. The information flows into Halsey's flagship, the New Jersey, a massive Iowa-class battleship that serves as his floating headquarters. Here is the threat that Halsey has been waiting for, the opportunity he has hungered for since the war began. Here is the chance to seek out the enemy's remaining naval strength and crush it in a decisive fleet engagement. The Japanese carriers approaching from the north are the force that is supposed to be destroyed, the primary Japanese striking force that American admirals have feared might appear and challenge American naval dominance. For Halsey, this is not a decision point. It is a revelation. This is what he came to do. This is what he has spent 4 years training for. The center force that Kurita is pushing southward remains in Halsey's mind a beaten enemy, a force that had retreated and that posed no immediate threat. The northern force is the real danger. The northern force is where the battle must be won. Halsey issues his orders to the Third Fleet. The entire formation will turn northward. The fast battleships, the pride of the American Navy, the newest and most heavily armored capital ships in the world, will go north. The carriers will go north. The supporting cruisers and destroyers will go north. Every ship that can fight at distance will be committed to destroying the Japanese carriers approaching from the north. The distance to be covered is roughly 100 kilometers, perhaps a few hours of sailing at high speed. Halsey's reasoning follows the logic of aggressive command perfectly. The northern force represents the greatest threat to the fleet. Every instinct he has developed over 4 years of war pushes him toward concentration of force, toward massing American strength against the enemy main force, toward seeking the decisive engagement that has eluded him since Pearl Harbor. He does not see himself as abandoning anything. He is attacking. He is doing what admirals are supposed to do when they identify an enemy force and have the means to destroy it. He is doing what Halsey has always believed is right. The San Bernardino Strait, the passage through which Kurita's center force must come if it is to threaten the American transports and support ships at Leyte, is left unguarded. Not forgotten, guarded by a battleship task force under Vice Admiral Willis Lee, a force that Halsey leaves behind for exactly this purpose. Lee's ships are the older, slower battleships, not the fast Iowas that are racing north, but they are still formidable warships. They should be enough. They should be more than enough to handle any enemy that might appear. Halsey does not believe any significant Japanese force is even coming through San Bernardino Strait. The center force has retreated. The threat has passed. But he leaves the battleships there anyway, out of caution, out of a desire not to leave his other commanders completely helpless. It is a gesture toward prudence from a commander whose essential nature is anything but prudent, and by leaving them, he believes he has solved the problem. The San Bernardino Strait is covered. The Third Fleet races north in the darkness, toward what Halsey believes is the principal Japanese striking force, toward what he believes is the critical battle of the campaign. But the forces racing north are not what Halsey thinks they are. The Japanese carriers that American reconnaissance has detected are nearly empty of aircraft. The pilots are gone. The trained aircrews are gone. These are hollow ships, floating steel with minimal combat power, designed in this moment to do one thing and one thing only: to be seen, to be reported, to be identified as a threat so overwhelming that American admirals will throw all their strength against it, to be a decoy of such magnitude that no American commander could possibly ignore them. And somewhere in the planning of this operation, in the brilliant, desperate calculations of Japanese naval command, this truth is understood perfectly. The Japanese know that Halsey's nature is to attack. They know that his reputation and his entire philosophy of war depend on aggressive concentration of force. They know that when he sees a carrier force, his first instinct will be to destroy it, and they have designed their operation around that knowledge. Throughout the night of the 24th and into the early hours of the 25th, Halsey pours reports into the system, confidence radiating from every message. Task force commanders are asked to prepare for dawn air operations. Estimates are made of when the northern force can be brought into range. Halsey and his staff are already thinking about how to position the fleet for maximum striking power against the carriers to the north. There is no hesitation. There is no moment of doubt. The decision to turn north is remade and reaffirmed with every hour. Other commanders in the American fleet are trying to sort out what is happening. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding the 7th Fleet in the southern waters near Leyte, is operating under the understanding that fast battleships from Halsey's fleet will be guarding San Bernardino Strait. He issues orders, assuming this protection is in place. He believes the northern threat is Halsey's problem, and that his own southern flank is secure. The layers of misunderstanding stack on top of each other like waves, each one reasonable in isolation, each one built on the assumption that Halsey's promise of battleship support at San Bernardino Strait is being honored. But Halsey's battleships are now 200 kilometers away to the north, racing toward carriers that cannot threaten any American ship once daylight comes and American aircraft can be launched. The Japanese center force, that massive concentration of battleships and heavy cruisers that Halsey had believed to be crippled and retreating, is moving through the darkness towards San Bernardino Strait. Kurita's ships are damaged, yes. His crews are exhausted, yes. His situation is desperate, absolutely. But he is coming anyway, because he has made a captain's choice to continue the mission, to push through the strait, to hope that American attention is directed elsewhere, to pray that confusion and darkness will allow him to reach the American transport fleet at Leyte before he can be brought to battle. Kurita does not know that every American battleship that could challenge him is racing north after a phantom threat. He cannot know this, but it is true. The night advances. Halsey sleeps in his cabin aboard the New Jersey with the confidence of a man who has made his decision and whose subordinates are now carrying it out. There is nothing to do but wait for dawn, for the carrier aircraft to launch, for the Japanese force to the north to be brought into view and destroyed. But at some point in the pre-dawn darkness, a message comes to Halsey's flagstaff. A Japanese surface force has been detected approaching San Bernardino Strait. Not confirmed, not certain. Just a report, one of many reports that flow through the fleet's communications during the chaos of any major naval operation. The message reaches Vice Admiral Willis Lee, commanding the battleship task force that Halsey has left behind. Lee passes the information up the chain of command, informing Halsey that a Japanese force may be approaching the strait, but the information is vague. The force is reported as 2 battleships and several cruisers. In truth, it is much larger. In truth, it is Kurita's entire center force, with the Yamato and her supporting ships pushing through the darkness toward an undefended passage. But the reports are confused and unclear, and Halsey chooses to interpret them as consistent with his prior understanding. A crippled, retreating enemy that poses no immediate threat. He does not turn back. He does not slow his northward advance. He does not bring any additional forces to San Bernardino Strait. He allows his fleet to continue racing north toward the carriers that he intends to destroy. What Halsey does not understand, what he cannot know in this moment, is that he is looking at the wrong battle. The real threat is not to the north. The real danger is not the Japanese carriers bearing down on his position. The real catastrophe that is about to unfold will happen to the south, through San Bernardino Strait, where Kurita's center force is about to encounter the escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3, the small ships that have been left to support the invasion because Halsey's fast battleships were supposed to be there and were not. The decision that Halsey is making in this moment, the logical decision in isolation, the aggressive decision that flows from everything he believes about warfare, is about to unleash a chain of events that will shatter the assumptions of the entire American fleet, that will put thousands of lives in jeopardy, and that will raise a question that no amount of explanation or justification will ever fully answer. How could a decision so logical produce consequences so catastrophic? The Third Fleet races northward through the darkness of October the 25th. Halsey stands on the bridge of the New Jersey with the confidence of a commander who is doing exactly what he was born to do, who is pursuing an enemy force with the full concentration of American naval might, who is about to prove once again that aggression and attack are the only proper responses to any threat. He does not know that the carriers to the north are nearly empty. He does not know that Kurita's center force is coming through San Bernardino Strait. He does not know that within a few hours, a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers will be thrust into a battle they were never designed to fight, against an enemy they were never supposed to face, without the protection that Halsey has promised will be there. But somewhere in the Japanese command structure, perhaps even in Kurita's mind as he pilots his crippled fleet southward, there is an understanding that the gamble just might work. The Americans have been led away. The strait is undefended. The opportunity, slim and desperate as it is, might just be enough. The stage is set for the most controversial decision of Halsey's career, to produce its most immediate and devastating consequences. The night is still dark. The dawn is still hours away, and nothing can be undone now. The choices have been made. The morning of the 25th of October, 1944, broke grey and uncertain over the Philippine Sea. For the men aboard the small escort carriers of Taffy 3, the day had begun like so many others in the campaign, tense, watchful, exhausting. They had been in position off Samar since dawn, flying combat air patrol over the landing beaches at Leyte Gulf, their slow-moving escort carriers churning through the water at their maximum speed of roughly 17 knots, protected only by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, whose combined firepower amounted to a fraction of what any genuine battleship could bring to bear. The transports they were meant to defend lay further south, still unloading the invasion force that had come to liberate the Philippines, depending on this thin screen of American naval vessels to keep them alive. No one aboard those ships expected what was about to happen. No one had anticipated the shape of the morning that was coming. The Japanese had thrown everything they had left into the waters around Leyte Gulf. 3 separate naval forces, coordinated by Admiral Takeo Kurita, had been sent to destroy the American invasion and drive the transports back out to sea. The plan was elaborate, ambitious, and utterly dependent on surprise. Kurita's center force, the most powerful of these elements, built around battleships and heavy cruisers, had been battered by American airstrikes the day before. The battleship Musashi, one of the two largest warships in the world, had gone down under waves of carrier aircraft. Yet Kurita had kept coming. He had turned his fleet around in the night, navigated through the San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness, and brought his remaining battle force south toward Leyte Gulf, hoping to arrive before dawn and find undefended transports waiting for him to destroy. What he did not know was that Halsey had taken every fast battleship, every cruiser, and every heavy carrier available with him in a northward dash toward what he believed to be the main Japanese striking force, a carrier fleet that was, in fact, nearly empty of aircraft and pilots. At 0630 hours, Japanese lookouts spotted the grey hulls of Taffy 3 on the horizon. Kurita could hardly believe what his scouts were reporting. Before him lay American escort carriers, slow, lightly armored, designed to support amphibious operations rather than fight fleet engagements, operating without the protection of fast battleships or fleet carriers. The Japanese commander had stumbled into exactly the circumstances any naval officer dreams of encountering: enemy capital ships caught without heavy support, vulnerable to overwhelming firepower. He ordered his fleet to close the distance and prepare for battle. The moment was his. The transports, the invasion, the entire American position in the Philippines seemed suddenly within reach of annihilation. Kurita could already envision the victory telegram being sent to Tokyo, the shockwaves it would send through the American command structure, the reversal of fortune that might yet spare Japan from total defeat. For the men of Taffy 3, the morning transformed in seconds from watchfulness into something approaching terror. Radar operators saw the blips appearing on their screens, dozens of them, growing steadily larger, moving steadily closer. The Japanese fleet was approaching from the northwest, and between those distant ships and the American escort carriers lay only empty sea. The commander of Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, made the decision that defined the morning. He would not run. He would not attempt to break away and abandon his position. Instead, he ordered his small force to turn toward the approaching Japanese fleet, to attack with everything available, to buy time for the transports behind him, and for whatever American forces might be racing to help. It was a decision that bordered on the tactically insane and crossed entirely into the realm of moral courage. The escort destroyers answered the call with an aggression that matched the desperation of their position. The destroyer Howell, a ship built to scout and screen larger vessels, turned directly toward the advancing Japanese battle line and began closing the distance at full speed. Her captain, Commander Leon Strickland, knew what he was doing. He was sending his ship toward battleships that mounted guns 3 times the size of his own heaviest weapons, toward heavy cruisers that could strike him from vastly greater range, toward overwhelming firepower that would shred his vessel into fragments before he could bring his own weapons to bear. Yet he turned that small destroyer directly into the teeth of the enemy and advanced. The other destroyers and destroyer escorts followed. The escort carriers, though they could not fight effectively against surface vessels, launched every aircraft they had, sending fighter bombers scrambling into the sky to make passes at the Japanese fleet, to add whatever weight their small bombs and machine gun fire could contribute to the madness of the morning. The Howell's guns began firing at a range where she had virtually no chance of penetrating the armor of her opponents, but she kept advancing. Shells from Japanese battleships began falling around her, sending up tremendous geysers of water that would climb hundreds of feet into the sky. One shell struck the Howell directly, tearing into her superstructure, killing men on her decks, filling her with smoke and fire. Still she advanced. Her destroyers, the Herman and the Johnston, followed the same path into the same deadly fire, making high-speed torpedo runs against the Japanese battle line, hoping to slow the advance, hoping to inflict enough damage that Kurita might hesitate or withdraw. The Johnston was hit repeatedly. Her steering systems were damaged, her engines wounded, her hull taking on water, and yet she kept fighting, kept moving, kept attacking, until she was no longer capable of moving or fighting at all. The Japanese commander began to waver. His fleet was hitting the American ships repeatedly, sinking the Howell, crippling the Johnston, destroying several of the escort carriers that had nowhere to run and no real means of defending themselves. The air was full of smoke and fire, and the sound of grinding metal meeting explosive force. Bodies of dead American sailors disappeared into the sea. The water itself seemed to be on fire, burning with fuel oil and burning with lives. Yet the Japanese advance had slowed. The relentless American attacks, suicide runs by ships and aircraft against overwhelming firepower, had created enough chaos and confusion that Kurita began to doubt himself. He had expected to encounter organized resistance from modern combat vessels. Instead, he was seeing something else entirely, desperation so absolute that it was creating an illusion of strength. Officers on Japanese ships began reporting confusion about their own position, about the location of their own fleet, about whether they were advancing or being driven back. The discipline of the advancing force began to fray under the constant harassment of attacks that cost them nothing but seemed to come without end. Approximately 40 nautical miles to the north, Halsey was racing southward with his entire Third Fleet, finally understanding the trap that had been set, and finally comprehending the scale of the disaster that was unfolding at Leyte Gulf. The message from Sprague had reached him, the urgent cry for help from the small force that was being pounded to pieces by the Japanese center force. Halsey turned his fleet, abandoned his pursuit of the nearly empty Japanese carriers, and drove south at maximum speed, knowing with absolute clarity that he might arrive too late, that the invasion force he was supposed to protect might already be destroyed, that the men aboard Taffy 3 might already be dead, or on their way to becoming so. The knowledge must have been corrosive, eating away at the certainty that had driven his decision to chase north in the first place. He had made a choice based on incomplete information and tactical assumptions that had proven catastrophically wrong, and now he was racing to try to undo the consequences of that choice. The turning point came not from Halsey's battleships, which would not arrive in time to fire a single shot at the Japanese fleet, but from Kurita himself. The Japanese commander, operating under the illusion that he was facing far more formidable opposition than he actually was, made the decision to withdraw. The perfect opportunity to destroy the American invasion was dissolving in his mind, replaced by fear that he might lose his entire fleet in a battle against an enemy that seemed to have reserves of ships and aircraft that never ran out. The center force turned away from its objective, turned back toward the north, turned back toward the San Bernardino Strait. Victory had been within reach. The transports were still there, still undefended, still waiting to be destroyed. But Kurita could no longer see it. He saw only the possibility of losing everything, and that possibility was enough to drive him away. The cost to Taffy 3 was terrible and absolute. The carrier Gambier Bay sank beneath the waves, the first escort carrier ever lost to enemy gunfire in the history of the Navy. The destroyers Howell and Johnston went down, taking dozens and dozens of their men with them into the water. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was destroyed, struck repeatedly until she simply broke apart and sank, killed so thoroughly that she vanished almost completely from the sea. More than 300 sailors from those lost ships died in the battle, and the 3 surviving destroyers were damaged so badly that they barely remained afloat. The escort carriers were battered, burned, and torn, some of them saved only by frantic effort and brilliant seamanship. It was an obscene price paid by men who had understood with complete clarity that they were going to die, and who had decided that the only meaningful way to die was to fight. Yet from the wreckage came something that would haunt Halsey for the remainder of his life. The battle had been won, if it could be called winning at all, not by the aggressive tactics and overwhelming force that Halsey had always believed should carry the day, but by the desperation of outnumbered men who had nowhere to run and nothing to lose. Sprague had not had the luxury of choosing aggression as a doctrine or a philosophy. He had had the necessity of aggression forced upon him by circumstance and the absence of support. The battle had vindicated his choice, but it had also exposed the cost of Halsey's absence, the price paid in ships and lives for the decision to chase north and leave the southern approaches undefended. Kurita did not know how close he had come to annihilating the invasion. The American sailors of Taffy 3 had known exactly how close, and they had paid in blood to preserve the outcome that their own sacrifice had guaranteed. As Halsey's battleships arrived at last on the morning of the 25th, the Japanese fleet was already withdrawing, already beyond reach, already receding into the distance towards safety and survival and eventual defeat. There was nothing left for the greatest fleet the Navy had ever assembled to destroy, nothing but the scattered wreckage of what Taffy 3 had already paid to preserve. Halsey had been denied even the final satisfaction of sinking ships in pursuit of the enemy he had chased. Instead, he arrived to find the cost of his decision written on the water itself: the burning hulks of American destroyers, the bodies of American sailors, the wreckage of hopes and prayers that had somehow